Good morning and welcome everyone to the FSA's June board meeting, which is being held here in Llandudno in North Wales. Our meeting today is being adapted a little in the light of the Prime Minister's announcement that a general election will be held on the 4th of June. The pre-election period has 4th of July, I'm being reminded. Not a good start. If only it had been the 4th of June, then we would have been through the pre-election period. But this period does have implications for all the FSA communications activities, as it does for all government departments. And we are following the Cabinet Office guidance for civil servants during this period. So taking those restrictions into account, Emily and I discussed this and took the decision that we would continue with the board's planned events, but with some modifications. So we'll hold the scheduled meeting just exactly as we usually would today, and whilst it is being recorded, it's not being live streamed. We've not published the papers in advance, and that means we've not been able to invite questions from the public or stakeholders in advance of this meeting, and we don't have any members of the public attending here today. We will release the recording on the 5th of July on our website, and we'll put the papers on there as well. There will be an opportunity for people to ask questions at that point in the usual way by submitting a written question and receiving a written response to our usual timelines. I do, however, appreciate that even though we have made those provisions, it's not the same as people being able to comment on papers in advance and therefore inform the board's discussions. So, in the light of that, we have made some modest changes to the planned agenda, which will ensure that we don't discuss any substantive policy papers or make any, very significant decisions about future work plans or advice to ministers and so forth. So what you'll see is that the agenda today is mostly comprised of relatively routine updates, annual reports and so forth to the board. It means the meeting's going to be a little bit shorter than usual, and we will hold over some of the bigger papers to our September meeting. So I can promise you it'll be a bumper board meeting in September, so one to put in your diary now and look forward to. With that preamble, we'll move into a much more regular board session, and we have no apologies today from board members, although Justin Varney is joining us online, and I think all of the FSA directors are here with us in person. So welcome to everyone, and I'd like to just take a particular moment to congratulate Junior Johnson, Head of Operations at FSA, who was awarded an OBE in the King's Birthday Honours just last weekend. We all know that Junior does an absolutely amazing job for us here at the FSA, but what perhaps we've all discovered through this is of all the work that he does outside, particularly the mentoring work that he does with young people, both, I have to say, within the civil service, but also in his community, leading youth groups. So congratulations, Junior. Thank you for everything you do for us at the FSA and for the wider community. Can I now ask if any board members have got any new external interest to declare, or indeed any interests which are directly pertinent to items on the agenda today? Mark.
It's not new, Susan, but I know Robin's report contains an item on official control laboratories, so just draw attention to my conflict there.
Okay, thanks. And we might just ask you to stay out of the discussion at that point. Thanks. Okay, so the next item is to turn your attention to the minutes from the last meeting. I know you've had a chance to look at these previously, but they're circulated in the papers today. Are there any factual corrections or anything which has been omitted? No, an excellent job as ever. Thank you to our minute takers. And then on to the matters arising. I'm actually very pleased to see that all the actions are complete, with the exception of the work on the foodborne disease thresholds, which was always scheduled to come to our December board meeting, and I know that work's in hand. But are there any comments on any of these items or anything where people want some additional information? No, we're cracking through the agenda today then. So we will move on now to the first of our regular items, which is my own update to the board. I suppose the place to start is by updating you on my own position as chair. As you know, I'd announced that I was going to be standing down at the end of my term of office, which is at the end of this month. However, ministers had asked me to stay on, and discussions were ongoing at the time the general election was called, so no recruitment campaign had been initiated. I've always said that I would not want to leave the FSA without a chair, and particularly not at this important time. And ministers and I agreed that it was very important that there was some continuity of leadership at the FSA. So I'm really pleased to tell you that I've been offered and accepted an extension to my tenure as chair. Once the general election is concluded, I'll obviously meet with the relevant ministers and discuss their aspirations for the FSA, and we'll take it from there. One other consequence of the election is that I've concluded that this year we will just do an internal board effectiveness review. In principle, we would do an external review every 3 years, but it seems to me that it would be most sensible to hold this over to next year when the new government's in place and where we'll have a better sense of the shape and operation of the FSA for the next parliamentary term. I've asked him as the Deputy Chair to lead an internal board effectiveness review, and we'll do that over the latter half of this year and report that as usual in the annual governance paper in December. I'll just pause there in case there are any questions about, if you like, the board itself. Okay, so moving on, my list of engagements over the last period has been published as usual. I think I'd say it probably has been slightly quieter, certainly over the last month, as most of the parliamentary meetings have been cancelled. Prior to that, the discussions with ministers were really focused mostly on our regulatory reform proposals and also on the new import controls, which, of course, were introduced earlier this year. I would say that wider stakeholders continue to be particularly interested in ultra-processed foods, and I was really pleased that we've now been able to publish some information on UPF for consumers on our website, and that seems to have been well received, and I hope it's something that we'll be able to keep updated as information about this emerges. In terms of engagements, I also want to particularly note my recent visit to Rome, accompanied by Liam Robson, our Head of International Engagement, who did a great job both before, during and after the visit. I was able to meet with quite a number of senior officials at FAO and the UK ambassador to the UN agencies in Rome, many of whom, of course, are focused on food, FAO, the World Food Programme, etc. The ambassador had organised a roundtable discussion with representatives from around the world who were keen to hear more about the work we're doing in the UK, but also to discuss the work that's going on in Codex, where it's clear that the UK contribution is very highly regarded. I also was able to meet with the Ministries of Health and Agriculture, and I was genuinely encouraged to hear their sort of warm welcome and their aspirations to work more closely with us on a bilateral basis. We do have quite a lot in common, and certainly in the Ministry of Health, they were interested in collaborating in relation to growing the science and evidence base, which underpins so much of our policies. And as you can well imagine, the topics that are on their agenda are very much the same as ours, whether that's precision breeding or regulated products and so forth. Ultra-processed food as well came up quite a bit. At the Ministry of Agriculture, we mostly talked about food fraud. I was really impressed with their laboratory setup they have there and with the sampling programme that they have. And we talked about potential opportunities to learn from them both at a scientific level, but also in the way we do the work of the National Food Crime Unit. It was, I have to say, a really, it was a day and a half. It was an incredibly productive and I think very, very useful visit. And I want to say great thanks actually to the FCDO and the British Embassy in Rome, who really helped to make that productive by setting up meetings and just looking after us very well whilst we were there. If I just look ahead for a moment, I've got meetings scheduled with the new Welsh Government Minister with responsibility for the FSA, Jane Bryant, and also with the new Health Minister in Northern Ireland, who recently replaced Robin Swan. So the new minister there is Mike Nesbitt. And of course, there'll be much work to be done in Westminster when the new government is in place there after the election. There are already proposals in some of the manifestos that have implications for the FSA, so we're looking closely at those at the moment. Regardless of the election outcome, the work that we do in the FSA to keep food safe, ensure it is what it says it is going to continue to be important. And I'm going to be very sure to express that to new ministers. Food safety is a consequence of good management, not good luck, and we can't leave this to chance. I'm really proud of the work that we do in the FSA, and I'm really keen that as the only government department that focuses solely and entirely on food matters, that we really do continue to contribute our expertise and resources so that we help to make the food system the kind of food system that people want and indeed need. So I think, a slightly uncertain time at the moment, but I think and hope a very exciting time ahead for all the work we do at the FSA. And I'm really pleased that I shall be here to do that with you. Thank you. Any comments, questions? No? Okay, all right. Well, we will move on and on to the next item, which always attracts more attention than my report. And that's the report from Emily, our Chief Executive, who'll really give you a much fuller rundown on all the work that's been going on. Thanks.
Thanks, Susan. Good morning, everyone. I think it's because you do so much scrutiny of us that we get more attention. So I guess I will start by just reflecting on the consequences of the general election for our work programme. There were a number of statutory instruments that we were hoping to lay in Parliament in June and July, and we've had to postpone those, obviously, and we will need to consider whether and when we represent those to incoming ministers. So particularly the work we were doing on regulated products reform related to ending the use of statutory instruments in our authorisation process and the use of renewals. And then we also had a statutory instrument that was going to help with the PACE powers for our National Food Crime Unit, and then one that related to import controls and the sort of latest update on particular commodities and check rates that we wanted to introduce. So we're just regrouping on those, and we'll wait for the election, and potentially we'll be bringing those forward again. In the report, I mentioned honours, but at the time I wasn't allowed to tell you about Junior. But we're very, very pleased for Junior. He's received this OBE for his services to the public and for his voluntary and public service. And Susan's already spoken about that, but we're very proud of him, and well done, Junior. The report covers a number of things that have happened in the last 3 months. So the Borders Target Operating Model being introduced at the last bit, some work that we have done on allergens, particularly in relation to the Codex Committee that's been considering the precautionary allergen labelling issue and whether to impose thresholds, which I know is of interest to the board. We've reported on some evaluation that was done of our large enterprise regulation pilot with retailers, which was in support of our Achieving Business Compliance programme, which suggests a positive outcome, and we'll be bringing a full paper to the board in September with some thinking about the long-term future of the regulatory system in the light of that pilot. I also was pleased to give evidence to the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee on the question of vets and whether there are sufficient vets in the country, particularly to do the public health work of official controls. And there has been a report, well, it's not really a report, it's a letter, but we're pleased with it from the chair of that select committee, which points out a number of systemic things and makes some recommendations to the government. I think we just need to be really conscious that that inquiry came about because of our annual report on food standards, where we'd raised the issue of vets. And I think then the chair also was able to raise that with a number of people. So we're very glad that the FSA Select Committee picked up that theme and investigated it. And I think it shows the significance of the annual assessment that we do on the state of food standards in the UK. I said in my written report that I would update you verbally on the question of unfolding incidents. So just to give you a bit of updated information on two that have been quite lively in the last week or two. We've had an S-Tech, so an E. coli incident unfolding. The situation as of 17th of June was that we had 237 cases, mostly in England, but they were across the UK. They had had an onset between the 29th of April and the 27th of May. There sadly were 2 deaths, although of course the cause of that isn't completely confirmed yet. We've done various bits of investigation. There have been 2 separate epidemiological studies and a food chain analysis led by our incidence unit, which narrowed down the source to a particular leaf, the Apollo leaf. But we need to keep an open mind still on whether that's actually the source, but that's our hypothesis. And there have been a number of preventative actions taken with the food industry. There was the withdrawal on the 13th of June and then 3 product recalls between the 14th and 16th of June. None of those products had E. coli detected in them, but we felt that with the level of uncertainty and potential risk, we felt that was an appropriate precautionary approach that was needed. The other incident that we were dealing with a week or 2 ago was related to listeria in sandwiches that had been eaten in hospital. So again, sadly, 2 people died related to 3. The cases were in 3 separate hospitals. All 3 had consumed sandwiches that seemed to have come from retail stores located in the hospitals, and there was a precautionary product recall of sandwiches there, and a site suspended operations to enable a deep clean. And we're seeing those cases, both in the E. coli and on listeria, have fallen again, but obviously a lot of work involved in that. The last thing I wanted to mention was just some of the visits that I've been on in the last period. A really useful visit to Yeo Valley, where we talked about some of their questions about labelling and regenerative farming, and we also had a conversation about ultra-processed food and how their thinking is evolving on that. I was able to go to Brussels, where there was a lot of interest from stakeholders there in our work on precision breeding, and actually quite a lot of appreciation and admiration for the approach that you've taken. And then lastly, I was really pleased to go to the Balmoral show. We had a great FSA stand there in Northern Ireland. There was a quiz you could undertake to find out if you knew what temperature your fridge should be at. And I also was able to meet with the Ulster Farmers Union, with senior people from the Department for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs, and visit the Fair Share stand as well. It was a fantastic day, and a big thanks to all of the FSA staff who peopled the stand there. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Emily. Helpful to hear about those incidents, and most importantly that they appear to be resolving. I don't know if people have got very specific factual questions about that, but if not, I would suggest that we've got the annual report on incidents later in the agenda, and I suggest we sort of hold over the wider discussion about incidents until that point. I've got some questions on the allergen thresholds, but I imagine others may have too. So let me invite questions from colleagues first. Mark, first out of the blocks.
I'm making a habit of this, aren't I? Thank you, Emily. I love reading your reports because it gives us such an understanding of the breadth of what goes on in the agency, but it also gives me the opportunity to ask a breadth of questions as well. My first one relates to your mention of the BTOM and how that's going. And appreciate it's very early days and there's bound to be some teething problems, so all that taken as read. But I have recently visited the new border control point in Kent, and I can report to colleagues that it's fully staffed and it's looking fantastic. And when I was there, it was completely empty of goods vehicles. And one of the issues that they raised when I was there is the means of getting those vehicles to the border control point, in as much as they flag vehicles on a system and they don't turn up. And so my question is really whether we're monitoring that and what the consequences are for loads of food, consignments of food that have effectively bypassed the controls and have just gone into the country. I also wanted to just draw attention to your lines on the ABC programme.
Mark, I'm going to interrupt. Shall we just do borders first? Are there any other questions on borders? Fiona. Oh, gosh, lots of questions on borders. Fiona, Rhian and Hayley, so we'll definitely...
Thanks, Susan. Again, it's a caveat question given that it's early days of the system, but I'm just wondering how much we're contributing to some of the language around the categorisation of products under the new system. I see we're getting a few queries coming in, and I know from experience that getting your product into the right category can mean that you have more or fewer controls on your product, but some of the nuancing of which category your product might fall into, it's a very fine line. So it's just a question of how we're contributing to that evolution process.
Rhian?
Thank you, Chair. It was a comment not dissimilar to Mark's, actually. So Margaret and I visited the Port of Liverpool a few weeks ago as part of our board induction, and appreciating it is very early days with the BTOM, but one of the pieces of feedback that persisted through that visit that we took was the cargo manifests coming off the ships that inform the officers about the cargo, and were coming off the ships at extremely short notice and in a format that was not digitally sympathetic. So they were in PDFs with a very clunky way of doing things, and it didn't give the officers a chance to look at the information and to act on it in a timely way. Now, we feel there's probably a function of scale there, and there are some ports that do this better, but the ask from the team that we met there was, a system that allows them to get that information in a timely way so they can select what they'd like to sample and inspect. So that was just a bit of feedback, really.
Hayley, then Margaret.
Thank you. Just two brief points. The first is I know the IT issues caused a big sort of hiatus in the supply chain, but I think we should acknowledge generally there are still concerns from businesses and stakeholders about costs and inefficiencies in the supply chain. But also I just wanted to acknowledge the National Audit Office report of last month, and I think there's some implications for the FSA there that we just need to stay abreast of. So they were pretty damning of the overall government handling of BTOM, and many of the concerns that we'd addressed in the past around delays, readiness, staffing at ports. But I think the key thing is that it goes on to say that they don't have much confidence in the UK being able to have the world's most effective border by 2025, specifically because different departments have got responsibility for implementing different parts of the model. So I don't have any lack of confidence in the FSA's role and all the work that we've been doing within the team, but I think it identifies as a strategic risk the lack of an integrated cross-government delivery plan. So I think internally we need to stay close to Anjali and her team to make sure that internally that is working to the best of the ability, as well as the supply chain issues. It's that internal cross-department working.
Yes, following on from Rhian, there were three further concerns that came up and surprised us in the visit to the Port of Liverpool, and thank you to the people there, the authority who showed us around. They're working so hard. They are concerned that they don't have enough staff or time to do adequate checks, even at the moment, and they're concerned, therefore, that food may be getting through that shouldn't be getting through. They mentioned grey goods, which I think you mentioned in your report, Emily, and which I'm happy to hold till we do the incidents paper in a bit. They're very concerned that next year they'll be required to do further checks unless things change again. They've recruited new staff 4 times, and 4 times new rules have then been pushed down the line, and they've had to sort of de-recruit, as it were, those staff. They think it's going to be very difficult to retain staff, let alone get any new staff next year, so they're concerned about that. They do report an increase in non-compliances recently, although they do say that most of those were related to paperwork. So I'm interested in your comments on that. We weren't expecting any of that.
Okay, Emily, I don't know if you or Anjali want to take that. I guess before you do, just in response to Hayley's comment about cross-government working, I've been part of a group that's been chaired by Baroness Neville-Rolfe, which has had representatives from across government. And I have to say, actually, I've been quite impressed by that group. So I think there is, a fair amount of communication. Obviously, what happens at that level may not be how it's manifest on the ground, but I think there has been a very serious effort to get people together and to work collectively on this one, certainly insofar as I've seen it.
So I'll just make a couple of general comments and then Andrew can pick up the detail. I think that this rollout has been plagued by the on-again, off-again nature of the last 3 years of approach. So I think the issue about staffing, for example, in ports is really difficult. And I think they've done their absolute best within the context they've been operating in, which has not been conducive to good and clear planning. I think we were assuming that at the beginning of this last bit of rollout, there would be errors and so on with documents, because that's what normally happens and as the system gets used to it. So that doesn't surprise me. But the issues about staffing are also things that we have said in our annual report on food standards, that we do think that there is an issue about overall capacity in the system. The specifics, I think I'll pass over to Anjali for. Thank you.
Thank you. Really helpful comments. Always really helpful to hear comments on this from the board, especially when you've been on visit. So I'll try to take each question in turn. Apologies if I miss anything. Mark, in answer to your question around Kent and vehicles bypassing and not turning up, my understanding, and this is an area we have been talking to DEFRA about, is if a load were to come in and not stop as per requirement, that becomes an illegal consignment, because there's a requirement to stop, so it's gone into the various into a local authority or wherever the end destination is, and it's not met the requirements to stop. So there is some further work we're trying to ascertain around that, but a headline in terms of my understanding is that becomes illegal and shouldn't be put on the market. Fiona, in terms of categorisation, really helpful feedback. It's an area the team have been working really closely on. The constraints are around what's available on the current IT systems, and it's aligned to the HMRC CN codes. So we are quite constrained on what that categorisation is described as, but I think that's why in Emily's report you see a lot of the queries are around risk categorisation and what does it actually mean in practice, but noted, and it is an area that we've raised again. In terms of IT, I think, Hayley, you raised the point around IT systems. That was an issue we were aware of. We immediately, when we heard about it, tried to ascertain and get to the bottom of whether there were concerns, particularly around products of animal origin. The IT concerns that were raised were mainly around plants. So from an FSA perspective, we were much reassured. That's not to say the systems are still, we're in learning process, we're still learning about them. I think Susan's covered the point about that strategic oversight. And then finally, just on funding and staff, Margaret, and I know Rian's also brought this up. As Emily said, we also hear a lot about the frustration of port health authorities based on how this policy has been on and off. I recently just spoke to DEFRA about this, and as board members will be aware, there's been a graduated approach to implementation. That makes it quite difficult for port health authorities. So what DEFRA has done just very recently is extended the funding to port health authorities around recruitment from March to July 2024 to try and help during this transition period as implementation is graduated to that approach, to try and help them before they can recover full costs. So I think it is noted and is something we constantly try to feedback, but really helpful.
Anthony.
Thank you. Can I just say that Northern Ireland is at the sort of sharp end of all of this stuff, and I would certainly share the concerns of some of my colleagues who have raised specific issues. Lorries bypassing and going straight through has occurred before, and has occurred actually over the last number of years. They are tracked down usually, and they are brought back, and they are illegal consignments. But one thing I wouldn't want people to miss is how smoothly this has actually gone in right across the board. And actually, I would like to thank the work of Angeli and the team, and the Northern Ireland team and the wider FSA teams, because this has really gone in without so much as a really major hitch. It has gone through. It is, as Angeli said, still in the induction phase. It's still working through, but I don't think we should miss the fact that our teams have done really great jobs, and the cross-departmental working has actually been very good. And I can say that with the Borders responsibility hat on from the board's point of view. I just think we shouldn't lose sight. It has been very good.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the message, that it's happening. That's fantastic. This is the final piece in the jigsaw, really, of the physical checks, but we are going to have to keep a really close eye on it as it gets up to speed. So we had already previously agreed that the Business Committee will monitor things like the risk categorisation as that evolves over time, but we probably need to think whether we've got the right reporting mechanisms for us to understand what's happening at the border as part of our routine reporting.
I just wanted to add, I think, Mark, your question about whether we're monitoring it, I don't think we completely answered, and so I'll talk to Angeli about that and come back. I think we just need to make sure we've got the right information flows going. Sorry, monitoring what? Monitoring the question of lorries coming through Kent. And making sure that we're spotting risk as it comes. As Angeli says, if something bypassed, it would be illegal, but I just want to make sure we've got the information flows in the right way, in the right place.
Having said we're doing some monitoring at the Business Committee, I do wonder whether we should agree to have a paper at the board at a suitable moment, maybe a year on, or so, I don't know, December or maybe March, where we can just take a view across the whole thing a year in, because actually we've had a whole number of different items here, and nobody's even mentioned trusted trader schemes, but if we had an update in due course, I think that probably would be helpful. I can see quite a lot of nods around the table, so let's take that as a specific action, and we can agree the timeline for that outside this meeting. Okay, that was the first item that Mark had on his list to raise with Emily, so I'm going to go back to him to have one more bite of the cherry.
Oh, just one. So just a couple of other points, if I may. Emily mentioned grey market goods. I was going to mention that sort of in conjunction with the borders thing, because by definition they're imported, so the best place to control them obviously is at the point of import, not once they get inland. And I know we now have a degree more control about how these things are prioritised at the port, so just to encourage us to look at that as a means of controlling that issue, if I can. There's part in your report about the ABC programme, and as you know, I've been closely involved in that. I'm really interested to know, I think it's very exciting where we are. I'm really looking forward to hearing the sort of detailed proposals when we get to September. I'm really interested to know how we're going to keep it alive and keep the passion that's involved in it going, both from our own staff's point of view, but probably even more important from the retailers who are taking part and who have invested greatly in that programme. So I'm just really keen to know how we keep it going whilst we get and then consider the proposals that we're going to hear in September. And my last question, as you've probably already hinted at, Susan, is around the allergen thresholds and the Codex report. It really bothers me that something which is described as moving from almost a 1% kind of threshold to a 5% threshold is described as, I'm going to paraphrase, but not that serious. It's really serious for those 4% of people, and the consequence of it going wrong for those 4% could be up to and including death. So I'm really interested to know what our approach to that's going to be and what our science is telling us inside that kind of wider remit of the Codex space.
Okay, so grey market goods, is, somebody else raised that as well. Do we want to cover that now, or do you want to take that in incidents? Okay, are we doing? Okay. Okay, let's do that in instance, because and then we'll stand a chance of keeping on time. So we've got two substantive points. I'm going to do the ABC. Is there any further comments around the ABC programme from people? I mean, I was incredibly encouraged to hear that the pilots have gone so well, and I know from conversations with stakeholders that there's a degree of interest and enthusiasm, as Mark says, about taking this forward. It was something that we had considered discussing today, and I felt that it did have such potential significance for the system that I wanted to hold that until we were able to do it in public in September. But Katie, I wonder if I could ask you just to give us maybe a slightly fuller update and perhaps a clearer sense of what comes next. I think I can confidently say the board is very interested in this and keen to see it move forward.
Thanks, Susan. Yes, so the evaluation report was very positive. I mean, I think I can say the headline is that it came out and showed us that the process we were running with the retailers was capable of making an assessment of their compliance that was sort of borne out on the ground. And there were quite a lot of real advantages to the way in which we were working, which were identified in the report. So we would have come to the board with a recommendation on next steps today. We will do that in September. But in the meantime, we're proposing to keep working with the retailers and the PAs in the arrangement we've got going, not lose the momentum on it in anticipation of coming to the board in September to recommend that we do take this forward in some form.
Thanks, Katie. And I guess a word for people when they listen to this recording later is that, you know, if there are comments on the way this work is developing, the team, Katie's team, would be very keen to hear those so that we can build those into the thinking as they move forward to proposals in September. Katie.
And just for anyone who may be commenting, just to be really clear that a very significant part of our next steps will be consultation and engagement. So I wouldn't want people to feel that's their only opportunity to comment.
Of course, yeah. No, this is just, I guess, formative input rather than consultation. Thank you. Very exciting. So we look forward to that. So then the other item was allergens, and I could see various nods on this side of the table around this. I don't know if anybody else wanted to come in on that, and then Margaret. Yeah, Tim, and then Tim, David, then Margaret.
Yes, I mean, it was just a +1 on Mark's comment, and just, you know, how we as a board feel and whether we're comfortable with the proposition of moving to EDO5. And also, do we believe that the evidence on which they're making those decisions, or making that proposition, I should say, is adequate?
It was just very briefly, I think Mark hit the point here. I'm not the expert on it. There's others in the committee better knowledgeable than I. But would we tolerate, this could be up to 5% of the population could be affected. And as Mark said, some of them can result in death. And as I understand, even the smell of some peanuts, whatever, enough to set some people off and have a serious allergic reaction. We wouldn't tolerate a 5% death threshold for listeria or any other illnesses or any other diseases. And I'm very, very worried that the experts have come up with a 5% threshold for this. But I'd like to hear more.
Margaret, and then I'm going to come to Rebecca, really, maybe just to tell us where we're at in the process and so forth. Margaret.
So bear with me. I think that we have very strong evidence which makes it very difficult for us to go to EDO5. And I want to just point out what that is, because I think staff will, if the board agrees and directs that way, staff will have to go into quite a difficult meeting at Codex and understand why the board takes a different view maybe to lots of other people in different countries. And I think the key thing is that we have commissioned our independent scientists at COT to look into this. They updated their report at the end of last year, and they are very clear. And I'm going to give you just a few quotes from that report. They say there is that insufficient evidence has been provided by Codex on these thresholds. This means that they cannot do an independent review of relevant values, or associated uncertainties, or to provide, Codex have not provided transparency by making their data available for others to analyse. COT considered the uncertainty related to ED values might be underestimated by Codex. They say there are important limitations and uncertainties, including that the data varies across the different allergens. And as has been pointed out, EDO5, 5 times more people, it's predicted, will have an allergic response. They say that although those responses may initially be small, every time you have an allergic response, you become more likely to have a worse one next time round. They give loads and loads of examples. They believe that COT has limited, that Codex has been limited in what research it has used, and there's lots of other research out there that hasn't been used. They believe, this is our scientists believe, that in the UK it is technically possible to adopt the more conservative EDO1 approach, and this can be supported by available analytical methods. And then they look at a statement that Codex has made, which says using EDO5 would have insignificant effect on public health. Our independent scientists say the complete opposite. They say that the evidence, in fact, says that using EDO5 instead of the more conservative EDO1 values would, in fact, significantly impact on public health. So what's the point of having our independent scientists if we don't listen to them? I think it puts us in a very difficult position if we went with EDO5 and that we should stick to EDO1.
Okay, so quite a strength of feeling there. Helpful to be reminded of the COT report, Margaret.
But it's evidence, Susan.
Evidence, yeah. Evidence, yeah. Nothing I like more than evidence. I suppose the other bit of evidence I'd add in, I was very struck by the report that we published the other week about the prevalence of food hypersensitivities, showing that there'd been, I think it was a 3-fold increase over the last, was it 20 or 30 years? So we've got a condition which is getting more common, and we're the Codex proposition is that we should actually become more liberal in the thresholds. You referred a lot to COT. I don't know if Robin wants to come in on COT or Rebecca. Anyway, I'll leave the two of you to choose how to respond to that. I think maybe it would be helpful if Rebecca told us where we were up to in the Codex process. And also, of course, in the end, this is a DEFRA responsibility, I think. But I'm very conscious of the strength of feeling in the board. Why don't, Rebecca, you go first, and then we'll leave Robin to do any follow-up on the technical COT report.
Yeah, thank you very much, Susan. Yes, so as you've noted, because of the international trade and international relations implications of Codex, because it's an international committee, the final decision on our negotiating position will be for ministers. But obviously, it's really key that the FSA board provides our advice to ministers about the food safety implications. And so we will be considering these latest proposals. So Codex have revised their proposals. That will be discussed this autumn, and we'll be providing our advice to the board about what we will recommend to ministers about what our GB position should be on this. It's an absolutely crucial issue. I would just note, though, that the reason that these threshold levels are being discussed is that at present there are no standards for precautionary allergen labelling that tell consumers with an allergy what it means scientifically in a way that can be standardised, so that a PAL label on one product will mean the same thing roughly in terms of risk as a PAL label on another product. So that would be, I think, a very important benefit for consumers if it could be done safely. But as the board has pointed out, the evidence needs to be there, not only that we understand those risks and we're really clear about the benefits that setting a threshold would bring, but also that the thresholds that are set can be verified through robust testing methods. And that's another area where we have concerns. So I will let Robin comment on the COT work, but in summary, as Margaret has pointed out, they've been very clear that they feel that there is insufficient evidence at the moment to back up the Codex proposals. So we'll be looking at all of this very, very carefully.
Robin.
Thanks, and good morning. Yes, so I think there's probably, from a science perspective, a couple of points here. So firstly, on yours, Mark, I mean, the definition of EDO5 versus EDO1 is 5 times more people affected than not. So you're quite right that in terms of, at face value, public health impact, there will be a more significant one with EDO5. Weighed against that is the fact that, of course, lots of businesses choose to set a more stringent limit themselves anyway. So it's not necessarily the case that automatically there will be 5 times as many cases if in that higher limit, because some companies won't move with that, but the threshold will be higher. I guess the other 2 important points here is that allergy rates, as Susan just alluded to, vary quite significantly internationally and are varying rapidly over time as well. We're doing a lot of work on that. So the risk in different populations will be different. And then I guess the last issue is the one that Susan's raised around the sort of science of detection, in that you need a robust method to detect whatever limit you're going to set. And that is different for different allergens. And so there is a slight risk, I would say, of confusion if you were to end up, for example, with different levels for different allergens and different detection methodologies. You might end up with a more complicated piece. In terms of the evidence base, I would totally agree with what CAT have advised, which is actually there is pretty robust evidence around the health impact of EDO1 and EDO5. Where we lack good data is around things like population level allergy rates in other countries and compliance rates in industry and the efficacy of the methodology to do it. So ultimately, this is not really a decision about the science of allergies. It's about the kind of practicability of a system that's implemented.
Okay, thank you. So can I just clarify then the next steps from here? So Rebecca, you mentioned that these discussions are ongoing in Codex. I just want to be clear on the timing of when DEFRA ministers will have to make decisions, and therefore when we need to discuss it as a board in order to ensure we've got adequate time to provide advice to ministers. So could somebody, Rebecca probably, just give me a sense of that timeline? And is this something that we can expect to see at the September board, or yeah?
I think we should give you an update at the September board. That would be the earliest point. I believe that this is due to be discussed in Codex in October, but I'll need to come back to you with advice on exactly which step in the process that will be. So in Codex, that there are multiple steps that proposals have to go through. We'll come back to you with some further advice on that. But I think we should certainly update you in September because it will come onto the agenda for the October Codex.
Could I just clarify? Is it our official view that our scientists are right, that we should not go past EDO1? If that is our official view, can we make sure that our officials in Codex in the run-up to discussions in September, October are maintaining that line that the United Kingdom will not go further than EDO1?
So, David, I think, firstly, that's for DEFRA ministers, not us, to take that view. But I think Robin did sum it up very well. So I think the scientific evidence that the risk is greater is absolutely clear. So I think that's, there isn't any great dispute over that. But the issue of whether the practicalities of this mean that's where the threshold should be set. Margaret, I'm not supporting one position or the other. I'm just seeing where the point of dispute lies, and I think we need to get advice on that.
But COT actually did address that, and I did quote what they said about that. They said technically we were able to deal with that in their report.
That doesn't address all of Robin's points about exposure levels in other countries and so forth. So I think in the end we could take a view about what was right for the UK, and but I just think this is a little bit more nuanced. I think it's hard to do it in just a verbal conversation. So I think what we need is a written paper in September. The important thing is that that is ahead of any decision making. So I think it's been useful to air this. It's been important and helpful, I hope, for officials to hear the level of concern in the board at the direction of travel in Codex. I think we need a written paper at the next meeting to understand where we're up to, and then we can have a fuller discussion with something in front of us. Are the board content with that? Nothing's going to happen before September, so there we go. Okay, thank you. Wow. So a few substantive items from the Chief Exec's report. Is there anything else? We've done borders, we've done ABC, we've done allergens. Tim.
Yes, thank you. I'll try and keep it short. I was really pleased to see the work on AMR. And I suppose my point, and perhaps a question, is just around the adequacy and robustness of the FCI data. FCI data is absolutely fundamental for us understanding what's getting into the food chain, and then whether we can trust that it continues to be safe and lowers risk around AMR, for example. And I just wanted to understand that when we were talking about the AMR surveillance and research, that we're still keeping a focus on the adequacy and robustness of that data. Obviously, I have practical, and here I declare an interest, practical experience of the ticks that go in right at the start of the food chain information, and being able to validate and verify, perhaps through either an audited approach or otherwise, continues to be important. And I just wondered if there's any reflections on that. Thank you.
I'll ask Julie to come in and reflect on that. And I'm always conscious that my mum sometimes watches these board meetings. So for her benefit, FCI is food chain information and AMR is antimicrobial resistance. Julie, over to you.
Thank you. I was actually going to ask Rick to pick up the AMR question as he leads on AMR for the FSA.
Yeah, so thank you. So, Tim, one of the things that has just happened is there's a new UK National Action Plan for AMR that's just been published. And part of that, the FSA has always been an integral part of that. We've been a member of that activity over the last 5 years, and we will continue to be a member of that board and the steering group for the next 5 years. So part of that is the work that we do, very much working in conjunction with DEFRA and Veterinary Medicines Directorate to ensure that we have this kind of One Health joined up approach. So we very much, what we are doing is looking at surveys in, say, retail meat, looking at levels of antimicrobial resistance. That's then joined up with the work that Veterinary Medicines Directorate, VMD, do, looking at AMR levels in livestock, for example. So we're trying to take that whole chain approach. We know that in the UK, one of the big success stories has been the usage, the reduced usage of antimicrobials in livestock. I think the figures are over the 5 years of the first National Action Plan were approaching a 60% reduction. A lot of that has been done through voluntary action, working with industry and government. So it's been a real success story. And in fact, at the wrap-up of the last National Action Plan board meeting, there was a real sort of summary of that data, and that's one of the real success stories. But linked into that was the work that we've done across government and including the work the FSA has done. That includes the PathSafe programme, and we saw an example of that yesterday, those of us who went to Bangor University, and the work that's ongoing to do surveillance in the environment, for example, and seeing how antimicrobial resistant genes from pathogens are moving into the environment and potentially into the food supply chain. So I think there is that very much that ongoing commitment to carry on that surveillance and ensure that we have a really good picture of the risks and the potential transmission of AMR through food. And that will be our ongoing role over the next 5 years.
Thank you. Okay, I think that's been a thorough going over of those issues, but we've highlighted some big ones. But as ever, there's a massive amount of work that goes on behind the scenes, which never really sort of floats up to the attention of the board, but is well summarised in Emily's update. So thank you to everybody for all the work that goes into that. PathSafe is a good segue into the next item on the agenda, which, well, actually, let me summarise there. So I think that we've agreed a paper on the BTOM, which will come either to December or March, a paper on the ABC proposals to September, and then an update in September on the allergen thresholds. So that's yet more for our September meeting. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is the annual science update from our Chief Scientific Advisor, Robin May. I'm going to ask Robin to summarise his report in a moment. You'll see it's quite a substantive document this year. We've slightly expanded it as I've asked Robin to give us an update, a sort of overview, really, of the work of our scientific advisory committees and to include the report on the work of the Science Council rather than having that as a standalone item. And you'll also see that his paper has a number of recommendations which we can come back and discuss. But Robin, why don't you give us the highlights?
Thanks very much, Susan. Yes, so the report is in front of you, so I don't intend to dwell on it now. I'm very interested to hear what people think. It covers quite a range of areas from sort of science assurance through to kind of future proofing for the organisation. Specifically on our scientific advisory committees, I think the first thing that I'd really like to put on record is our enormous thanks to the people who serve on those. We have over 100 independent experts who give up their time, often in many cases a huge amount of time actually, to deal with some really thorny issues and do so very freely, and we could not function without them. So on record, our great thanks to them. There are a number of recommendations that I've put in there about our scientific advisory committees and some of the risk assessment work that they're associated with, around some things such as having more open meetings. The board will be aware this year in particular there's been a lot of discussion in the media around conflicts of interest and scientific advice to government more broadly, and so there are a number of things that we should, I think, do to address that. I would like to say very clearly that I don't think there is a problem here. I do think that we have really high standard of independent expertise on our committees and a lot of processes in place already that support that. But I do think there are some things we can do that would really help make that very transparent. For example, ensuring we have open meetings for all our committees at least once a year so people can attend and join in. There are some practical issues associated with that, not least timing for committees that are already busy. But I think that's something we should look at. There is then my usual slightly broken record, worries about official labs and sampling, which I think actually, in a more positive note, there has been significant cross-government progress over the last few months, I would say, in terms of lab capacity and in terms of training in particular. I've been very pleased to see the very broad agreement from other departments too about concerns around the supply of toxicologists. There are some things in train to help address that. They do not, in my view, go the full way to making sure that everything is fine and dandy, but it's a good step in the right direction. I look forward to keeping those conversations going over the coming months. And then finally, in the report, I talk a bit about partnerships, which I think are more important than ever, particularly in a resource-constrained environment that we're in at the minute. It makes a lot of sense for us to work very closely with other departments and independent funders. And some areas where I think we should be very attentive to the future. As we discuss a lot at this board, the food system is a very fast-moving system, lots of interesting developments around all sorts of things, cell-cultivated products, microbiome, ultra-processed foods, Susan's already mentioned. And I think there's some merit in us working even harder than we currently do in being ready for those kind of novel foods as they come to us for regulation in the near future. And with that, let me stop and take any questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Robin. It feels as though it's been a particularly busy year for the CSA, actually. And you didn't even mention your contributions to 2 select committee inquiries recently, both in the same week, I should say, which I think makes it... and I thought your contributions were very sort of clear and thoughtful to both. I think you've also done a great job for the FSA in some of the media appearances, particularly around the Loch Ness incident in Northern Ireland, which board members might not have seen since it featured more heavily in coverage in Northern Ireland than it did here. But Robin did a very extensive interview, and I think I think that really showed that combination both of really deep scientific knowledge and a very good way of communicating. So don't blush too much, but thank you very much. Let me open this up, Anthony.
Thank you, Chair, for raising the Loch Ness issue, because actually I can echo everything you've said, and the fact that other government departments in Northern Ireland were very pleased that actually we took the lead in going forward, and that Robin actually presented the facts very clearly, very good and very well. So I think the report actually underestimates the work that you did there. But when NIFAC looked at this and had the discussion on the paper, one of the questions that came up was the issue of conflict of interest, and we decided perhaps it wasn't really a conflict of interest, more a case of bias, and particularly biases of chairs. And we had a discussion with Robin how best you can avoid bias within the information that we're getting put forward and the opinions that are going forward. But there was also an invitation to Robin in particularly the work that was set out in sections 11, 20 and 23, which thought that actually there are some really groundbreaking leading research facilities happening within Belfast and Cork on the island of Ireland. And we thought that actually we could make the introductions through some of the NIFAC members for Robin, if he would like to take that up. So that's a standing offer, just to actually facilitate that work on an interjurisdictional basis. But thank you.
That's great, and Robin and I have talked often about how we can stimulate more people to get involved with our SACs, because part of the reason that they are as overworked as they are is because we don't really have quite enough members. So if we can, broaden that out, that would be really, really helpful. For those of you who don't follow Robin, it's not only Loch Ney, but we've had quite a bit on raw pet food and glycerol slushies and all sorts of things that make for quite a mixed portfolio, I'd say. Okay, so on the issue of the SACs, and particularly this conflict of interest point, are there any other comments that people wanted to raise on that? If not, are people content with the sort of recommendation? Oh, Fiona.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. It's to do with some of the areas of new science, Robin, given that a lot of the new science is being led by a commercial or commercially funded team to develop new technologies. And so it's going to be a challenge, I guess, to find people who are independent. And possibly one has to go abroad to find some of the expertise that might sit externally to advise us on a domestic matter. How do you negotiate that?
Rian, did you want to come in on this as well? Not on this.
Thanks. Yes. So on both of those points around SACs, so I totally agree, Anthony, with the comment about this is not just about overt conflicts of interest. And I think I made the point in the paper that there is a sort of a slight assumption, I think, sometimes that a conflict of interest is about money and have you been paid. Actually, I think it's important to recognise that everyone has intrinsic biases. That might be about who you've been employed with or what research you do, but it might just be about where your kind of passion lies in research. You think that, I don't know, microbiology is much more important than all other types of science or something. So I think it's just important that we recognise that and have that out in the public domain. And to your point, Fiona, I think that's absolutely right. If I look at the food system as a whole, probably the vast majority of innovative research is coming from the commercial sector, not the public sector. And so if we were to have a blanket ban on ever having anybody who's ever done any of that work on any of our committees, we'll have no one on any of our committees. International is really important. We already have some international members, very keen to have good international representation. The science is the same all over internationally. But I do think that it's really important that we don't close the door to expertise, but we do very much make clear to all our members that you need to be very transparent about this and that we handle those conflicts in a meeting appropriately, in some cases by asking to step out of the discussion at that point.
Esther, could we make it clear as a board that we have complete faith in the integrity of the experts, advisors on our scientific committees? And of course, they'll have done work. A person is not a top expert if they've never done work for a government department or a commercial enterprise. And if you find a scientist who hasn't done work for any of these bodies, he or she is not up to much. So, of course, the top ones are bound to have done some other work in their time. And the crucial thing is, are they bringing a bias or a personal interest to the work they're on now? And I'm absolutely convinced our people have got complete integrity and have not done so. But I agree with Tim, we need openness in all of their dealings.
So I think that Robin's in paragraph 4.6 really makes that point, and I haven't heard anybody arguing against that. I think the key issue on this is that Robin's made some recommendations 3 to 6, about how we try to go even further in relation to transparency. I do think it's helpful for members of the public to be able to watch meetings happening, because I think it's in the way people express and talk about issues that people can be hopefully reassured, but if they have concerns, at least would then be able to raise those concerns with us. So I recognise the practical difficulties, but I don't think it's beyond the bounds of possibility. We do these board meetings in public, so there's a number of other recommendations about the SACs, and I think the idea of doing this random audit on interests is also helpful, because sometimes people have just forgotten things, and it would be helpful if we point that out. It will raise everyone's awareness. So they all seem very sensible to me, and I think we should. I'd be keen to endorse those if others are happy. I can see Justin wants to come in. Justin, was it on this specific point about conflicts of interest more widely? Okay, fine. And I was also, well, let's do the conflicts one first.
Thank you, Chair. Just to say, I think there are 2 points. One, firstly, I support the recommendations. I think they set out a more robust process. And I think particularly also the recommendation, which is about having a formal system for assessing and acting on conflicts of interest in recommendation 8. But I think also the point of this is the reason we have a committee. It is a SAC committee, not an individual giving a singular view or a singular opinion to advise the FSA. And I think that's a really important point to draw out. And I think that's also where the recommendation 9 of having the new associate SAC member type structure will help bring those diversity of views, and that allows the internal challenge to happen within the SAC, which is essential for us getting a rounded view of the evidence and mitigating against some of the realities that David pointed out. So I fully support the recommendations in it, but I do think it's important we recognise we're not working with singular experts. That is the reason why we have the SAC structure.
I think that's a really good point, Justin, well made. Rhian and Tim.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks to Robin for coming and talking to WFAC about this report last week. We had loads of questions, but just a couple that are with my Wales hat on, I suppose. We support the recommendations. Just recommendation number 11 about the laboratory testing capacity. It is a concern to us in Wales that there might not be the capacity to meet the needs in our region. And just a question, I suppose, about whether there are any sort of assets like our universities and our food centres where we can offer up some sort of solution for the UK, not just for Wales, but just wanted to put that there because I know that was important to WFAC members that we, our ecosystem in Wales is really sort of geared up potentially to contribute to that capacity issue. The second thing around recommendation 17, so WFAC, we did highlight there is a sort of an on-the-ground observation about that flow of information on infectious diseases actually was what we were talking about, and flow of information to the local authorities from APHA, for example. It is a really real observation that we have. So anything we can do there just to maximise the impact that PathSafe has, and we really should. And again, an offer of collaboration or case studies or examples from Wales where we might be able to find solutions to that data transfer, we would be happy to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. Tim.
Thank you. And great report, Robin. Really, really enjoyed going through it and reading it. And of course, it then made me think of certain questions that I might come up with. And one of them was really around the sort of novel foods. Whether it's in the context of ultra-processed foods or microbiome or alternative proteins, cell-cultivated products. And it was really just to ask that we continue to be apprised of the developments here because it's a fast-moving field and whether or not we'll be able to keep pace with it and how we will focus to do that. So to hear back on that, not necessarily now, but as we go through in the future, because it occurred to me that often we focus on the process and the technique, but actually it's the outcome and the novel molecules that perhaps haven't been used in a food context before. And whether or not there's collateral bioactivity, whether that's the biome or in our own metabolism, that we need to get a pace with understanding. So it's really just to hear a little bit back from you now perhaps, and just to say, can we keep abreast of it as we go forward in the future, particularly in the context of regulating new foods? Thank you.
Before I ask Robin to comment, are there any other broader questions on this paper that anybody had? Fiona?
A specific one to pick up on what Tim just asked. I think the example is the Knowledge Centre for Alternative Protein Innovation, and I'm just interested to know how that will, what we put into it and what we take out of it. But it's a very, it's a very fast-moving part of food science and quite a, it could be scary for some consumers and a real value equally going forward into the future. I've got a few other questions which aren't on this topic, so I can come back to this.
We'll keep going with them, and then we'll come to Robin to sort of canter through each of the points.
Okay, thanks. Robin, you talked about skills, and I think the other teams in LA and vet resourcing particularly have done a great deal of work to look at mapping future workforce needs and looking at how qualifications can enable, and training through partnership networks, which I know you're already looking at. It can enable us to ensure that we've got a suitable workforce for the future. And I'm just wondering how much workforce mapping is being done around this area, particularly for toxicologists, because like vets, like local authorities, it sits across a number of different government departments and delivery agencies. So that was number one. And the second was going back to PathSafe, which really just seems to be coming into the infrastructure as a really key bit of research that has led to some techniques and methodologies that we can use long term. So my question is, after all of the government money that's gone into this, I think it's £12 million plus now, what happens next? Is an agency going to be responsible for picking it up and making sure that those technologies are going to be used into the future? How does it work going forward?
Thank you. Any more comments on Robin's paper? Justin, you're our lead for science. Anything else you wanted to raise on this paper?
Yeah, I think it gives a good overview, and I think there are, when we get to September board, I think there are further bits we'll want to pick up on about how the science part of the FSA fits together with the regulated products part and the functional operation of the FSA, because I think it's really important. We don't see science in the FSA as a bubble. It is fundamental to the delivery of our duties and responsibilities as a regulator. And actually some of the vulnerabilities that we've had in the science sector, I think are improving, particularly the rejoining of Horizon has been really beneficial in giving us access back to those European networks of science and evidence understanding. But I do think it's something that board members and those watching really understand, is that science is not an independent pillar. It is absolutely fundamental. And I think in the September board discussions, it will become quite clear about how the interconnection of our science capacity and capability underpins some of our statutory responsibilities on regulation.
Great, thank you. Important reminder. Robin, so there's a few items there. Why don't you pick up the ones you remember, and then I'll see if there was any extras.
Glad you offered that, because I'm hoping I've jotted them all down. Thanks very much for those comments. Quite a lot there. So let's start. So first on labs and capacity. This is an enduring challenge, not just for us. It's right across the sector. There have been a lot of conversations across government with other departments, other CSAs in particular, at that. I think there are issues around the physical infrastructure, a physical lab, the equipment that's in it, etc., etc. There are issues around skills and training, having the people who are able to do that, and quite a big issue around accreditation and standards. So often you can have someone who can do a test that you need, but it's not accredited to be then used, for example, in a court case, and so that's not actually helpful. So I think there is more we can do in terms of the wider network. The university collaboration that you mentioned, Rhian, is one that I'm very keen on. I have to say it is tricky, and we've done some looking in the past about where that has worked and not worked in the past. And one of the issues often is that if you are outsourcing a service, for example, to a university, as we all know, university leaderships change. Suddenly there's a new administration, and something you thought was a kind of national resource is not there. It's supported in the same way that you thought it was before. So I do think that's quite a difficult conversation, one that's very active. I think one of the things that we really need to be quite clear about is that these are absolutely essential in terms of capability, particularly for incidents. They are expensive things to run, and they don't make a profit. So it is always a very difficult argument to say that we need to invest in something for something that might never happen. But that does not mean we should not be doing it, because we need that resource there. So yes, it's not a very robust answer, but it's certainly very high on my list. On flows of data, data is the biggest challenge, I think, that we would probably all say, all CSAs would say, sharing data is a really big challenge, particularly the kind of data that we need in FSA, which involves often confidential patient data, commercially sensitive data, these kind of things. Lots of work going on, and Julie might talk more about that at the September board, or possibly even now, about what we're doing to try and address that. I think PathSafe has been a fantastic example, slightly blending my answers here, of where simply making a statement and getting a lot of people together to do something jointly has a really big impact in terms of showing people that it can be done. And actually what we're seeing now in PathSafe, and one of the things that you mentioned, Fiona, about it now coming to fruition, is that it's been running long enough that people are now volunteering their data and coming forwards and saying, well, actually, I think there's merit to me as well as to you in sharing this. The more of that we do, I think the better to achieve those kind of aims. On novel foods and processes, Tim, yeah, absolutely. I'm obviously very happy to kind of come back and keep reporting it. I think one of the things I would stress there is the pace of change is really quite remarkable and very difficult to predict. AI is a good example, I think, where 5 years ago I suspect if I'd have stood here saying, well, you might be able to get somebody to write your essay, a computer to write your essay for you, and it'd be quite convincing, I think we might have all laughed, and now actually it happens very regularly. So that an AI entry into the food sector, for example, is something we have not yet seen massively, but I'm sure will come. For example, AI-designed novel foods might well be just around the corner. Cell-cultivated products, another example. So very happy to keep reporting back. Likewise, very keen to hear people who are listening to this later on. If you know of stuff that's happening, we're always very happy to hear about that. One of the biggest challenges we have is sort of being aware of things that are at a very early stage of development. It is incredibly useful for FSA to know about stuff that is at an early stage of R&D so that we are ready to look at it when it comes to market. The more we know early on, understanding commercial sensitivities, the better. I think in terms of the Alternative Protein Centre, I might ask Rick actually to comment on that in a second, because he attended those meetings, Fiona. But just before he does that, that comes to that point about partnerships that I have in the report. All of these things I think we cannot do in isolation. And actually what we're seeing increasingly is a real collaboration between, for example, public sector academic work, which might have the idea and the patent perhaps, SMEs and developing that, and then a collaboration with big retailers. And so being part of that conversation through vehicles like the Alternative Protein Centre, I think is incredibly important for us. And absolutely, the more we do, the better, I think. But Rick, I don't know if you wanted to pick up on the alternative proteins.
Super quickly.
Yes. So I think we might get an announcement about that in July. I understand that maybe UKRI have made the announcement. But it's one of three things. So very much this is a big investment from UKRI as the big science investor. We have been involved in the conversations. We will be partners in it. It's an opportunity to understand what industry is doing. So there's horizon scanning. There's a chance to engage and train and educate SMEs, but also an opportunity to do maybe pre-competitive research, understanding what the potential risks are in the collective kind of way. So I think that's the sort of threefold advantage we see of things like the centres.
Great, thank you. Well, that's been a really, really good discussion. I'm conscious that we haven't gone through each of those individual recommendations, but I think there's a strong sense that people are supportive and have confidence in your leadership over this, Robin. What I'd encourage is for you to sort of work, with the executive in taking some of these forward. And obviously, if people want to send in specific questions on this report later, then we can also feed that into the thinking. I think there was some good suggestions around the SACs that we had at the start. The other, I think, two things have struck me in this conversation. One is about how we can, do even more to maximise the input and the engagement we have with other academics, and we heard that both from NIFAC and from WFAC. I'm sure if we had whatever an England FAC was, you'd hear the same thing. I know it's something that maybe last year or the year before you and I discussed about how we could boost this, and indeed the associate members came out of that conversation. I'm conscious, thinking back however many years, probably quite a long time now, we used to have an event around the Chief Scientist's report and so on. And I just wonder if there's space for us to think about a sort of event with academics about our science, because if they don't know what we're interested in, it's hard for them to engage. I don't know what that would look like, but I think it might be worth giving some thought. Clearly with PathSafe on the microbiological side, there's actually quite a good community developed, but there may be other areas of our work where we've got less good good contacts. And I know through the workshops you've mentioned, both on ultra-processed food and indeed the microbiome one, that may be the start, perhaps, of boosting that. I don't really know what I'm suggesting, but I guess I'm suggesting that you and the team have a think about whether there is something more we could do at a more strategic level to boost our engagement with the academic community on these very policy-relevant pieces of research. And then I think the other thing that I've heard is the board's appetite for hearing more about some of the very future-focused new things, so cell-cultivated proteins, new technologies more generally, AI in particular, and I know Julie's team have been thinking about this. I'm not sure it's something for the board meeting at this stage, but perhaps if we could think about some board briefings outside of the public meetings on some of these topics, and if board members want to get in touch with me about if there are particular things they'd like to hear more about, I could discuss that with you and with Julie and think how we arrange that. And, maybe we want to invite, people outside to come and talk to us about some of these topics. Anyway, fantastic. Great to hear the interest and engagement. As Justin said very astutely, science may come in its own paper, but it is absolutely underpins everything we do. We take pride, and I'm certainly pleased to lead an agency which is grounded in science and evidence. And thank you to you. Huge thanks to all of the members of the SACS, the Science Council, the Advisory Committee on Social Science, and indeed to all the scientists we have within the FSA who are working hard on all of this. Thank you. I don't think there are any. Well, we've got a few actions there, but there's nothing specific new to come back to the board, I don't think. Very good. So moving on now to the next item on the agenda, and pleased to welcome Sam Faulkner to join us at the table. Sam is the Deputy Director of Strategy, and Sam has presented to the board a number of times on our strategic objectives, and obviously was instrumental in helping to develop the strategy which we published in March 2022, yeah. So as part of the discussion we had when we agreed the 3-year corporate plan back in July last year, we asked the executive to provide us with an annual update against the strategic objectives. And this is really the first of those updates. I guess what I'd say is this is, in a way, a chance to talk about everything that happens in the FSA, but it also is not. This is our moment to actually just look at a slightly higher level and to think about whether we're really achieving our strategic goals. Are we pointing in generally the right direction? Have we got the balance of work right? And I want us to probably try to avoid deep diving into individual components and try to just stay up at that level of strategic assurance. Obviously, if we think there are gaps in what's there, then let's hear about that too. But Sam, why don't you, thank you for the paper. I know it's taken a little bit of work to think how best to present these to the board, but why don't you just summarise it for us now? Thanks.
Thank you, Susan. As you say, this paper is an opportunity to step back from the day-to-day running of the business and understand how well our strategy is influencing across the food system. So as you mentioned, are the indicators we're measuring moving in the right direction? Are we delivering the right portfolio of work to support that, or do we need to do anything different to meet the ambitions that we've set ourselves? And I should say that this report pulls data together from a number of places across the FSA, so huge thanks to all the teams that have contributed to it, and of course the team that's actually pulled the paper together itself. And although much of the data that you see here is available elsewhere, be it in the annual report on food standards, our annual report and accounts, via the business committee or in other specific reports that we put out there, bringing it together into a coherent set of indicators provides a view of the key aspects of the food system through which we can understand the broad impact of our strategy. But measuring that impact is really difficult. And so the indicators are designed to give an overall picture of what is happening rather than, as you say, Susan, delve too deeply into individual pieces of work. And the report itself is structured against the 3 strategic ambitions that we set ourselves. So the first ambition recognises our work in maintaining food that you can trust. And trust, as we know, is a critical measure for us here at the FSA. particularly consumer trust in the food system and in ourselves. And we recognise the reduction in trust in our latest published Food and You 2 survey data, which is discussed in paragraph 2.2. I think there's a couple of things it's helpful for the board to understand on context around this. Firstly, obviously the FSA is not immune to wider trends in trust between institutions and the public sector in particular. Secondly, although this wave of Food and You 2 was published in April 2024, the data collection period is between April and July 2023. So we have some more recent data that we can talk about as we move through this discussion today. And on the data itself, it's important to note that the decrease is largely as a result of an increase in neutral scores for neither trust nor distrust, rather than a specific increase in distrust responses. But this is something that we take very seriously, and you'll see in the paper that we've set out actions in paragraphs 2.7 and 2.8 to further understand this issue and take steps to maintain our levels of trust. These include exploring how we can improve the reach and impact of our communications to a wider audience, and understanding further analytical work to see what the drivers of the decline are and how we can address them. But finally, in more recent data from our consumer insights tracker that we talk about in paragraph 2.5, this suggests that it may not be a sustained downward trend in trust in the FSA overall, and we await the next publication of the Food and You 2 data, which is out in Q3 of this year, to see how this has trended through. But although this is a bit reassuring, we are not complacent, and we do really want to understand what is driving this and how we can continue to maintain the levels of trust that we want to. Moving to Ambition 2, the agency's core focus remains on work ensuring that we can maintain food standards and safety, so that food is safe and what it says it is. And the indicators chosen for this ambition shows that things in this area are relatively stable. And so at the moment, there's nothing indicating that we need to do further analysis or change our approach. Because delivering against this indicator is the key part of the FSA's job. And although we talk internally about the 3 pillars of our strategy, I want to reiterate here that food safety and standards, as pillars 1 and 2, are by far the majority of our work, and we'll continue to focus and prioritise our work in these areas. The third pillar that we talk about is summarised in our third ambition, which is to grow our contribution to food that is healthier and more sustainable. And in addressing this ambition, we continue to try and make valuable contributions working across government to projects that support this. And I believe broadly that we are meeting this ambition, balancing our work in this space against our core statutory functions. And our agreed progress indicators here was to report through case studies of the work we're doing. And I'm happy in the paper to say that there's 3 such case studies: the Food Data Transparency Partnership, our work on school food standards, and then specifically vending in Northern Ireland. And these reflect the variety of work that we do in this space, including our policy responsibilities in Northern Ireland and then delivering targeted projects to meet our ambition. So finally, I'd just like to ask the board to note the overall findings in the report and then specifically agree to the proposals that we want to talk about in paragraphs 2.7 and 2.8 to respond to the decline in our trust indicators. Thank you. I'll pass back to Susan.
Thank you very much, Sam. I think you made a really important point there about sort of pillar 3. I mean, when one talks about 3 pillars, I always sort of think of 3-legged stools, and there's a sort of assumption that somehow they're all equal, and that isn't the case, as you've made clear. I do think there has been a real shift in the way people throughout the agency think about our roles in relation to healthier and more sustainable foods. It feels a much more natural part of the conversation across a wide spectrum of our work. And I think it's also, we're also seeing better and deeper conversations with colleagues across government on this. And I hope that's something that in the new Parliament we'll be able to do more of. So I think there's a general level of this that's been set in the agency, which is really important. But I think what the case studies do is show where specific decisions have been made to do work which really prioritises that particular topic. And I'd be really keen to hear from board members whether you think we've got that. It's not a balance right, but we've got those proportions right in terms of effort and investment. And of course, you make the point too, Sam, about the apparent decline in trust ratings, which is difficult to interpret when it feels quite historical. Pace of change is so fast. Data from last year feels quite historical. But enough from me. Comments from others on this? Oh, gosh, lots in. I'm going to Rhian go first, and then Hayley, then Mark.
Thank you, Susan. It was to the point about ambition number 3, actually. Possibly trying to be too clever and tie it into your paragraph 2.7 about trust and that measure, which is a macro measure, I know. But we had a conversation at WFAC last week about the case studies that could help illustrate ambition 3, but also boost what we could do with our comms under the topic of trust. So in Wales, we've got the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, of course. That legislation is groundbreaking. And the work of the Commissioner for Future Generations, I know the Wales team have met with the Commissioner, but there will be a wealth of case study information within the work of the Commissioner and his team that we might draw on if we want to boost ambition number 3 there and draw it for the wider UK comms as well. So different ways of engendering trust in us in that roundabout way. So that was just a thought.
Thank you. I met the Commissioner actually at the Royal Welsh Show last year and hope that we might be able to do so again this year, but it may even be that we should organise a separate meeting to see how we could build on that. Thank you. Anthony, is this a NIFAC? Okay, well let's hear from NIFAC as well, and then we'll come on to Hayley and Mark.
When NIFAC looked at this, they understood the paper, thought it was good, agreed there was an erosion, waiting to see if there was an upturn that came from that. But they did query the prioritisation process that might be applied to the FSA work streams if budgets do become tight. And you did mention that the focus is on streams 1 and 2. And given that we are 3, there was a real concern that perhaps if budgets became too tight, we would begin to lose a focus on 3. In Northern Ireland, and we just wanted some reassurance that actually it is still 3 ambitions and we are still going, even at a smaller, reduced level, but it is still a priority for us.
I guess that's almost rather more of a strategy and resourcing question, maybe one for Emily rather than for the objectives, but I appreciate you passing that message on. We've also got the report from the director in Northern Ireland later, so maybe we can perhaps pick up the detail of that work then. Hayley, Mark, and then I've also seen Justin's got his hand up.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam. I think just on the question around the actions, obviously we do need some context and narrative around the decline in trust, and we shouldn't be complacent. But I think I'd be interested to see if it was a blip or a trend before we invested too much time and activity. But obviously we sort of leave the team to be the judge on that. Equally, depending on when the next data is collected, I wouldn't be surprised if impact of the Christmas Kirkham's incident, the recent E. coli, depending on when the data collection period is, we might see another blip. But as you say, consumers are responding to government and supply chain issues all the time. My other comments are just more generally around the indicators. It is very challenging for any sort of regulatory or oversight body to come up with high-level indicators, and I know we get a lot more detail at business committee. So in a sense, we're trying to sort of blend the two. But one thing we do well is to have that external consultation with the users of our services, particularly around consumers, and that's really valuable. But I did wonder if there's more that we can do around business. So, turning to sort of WFAC and NIFAC, we get that continuous qualitative input from business and stakeholders about all of our services and touch points. But I think, is there a gap in England? Could we be doing more with businesses through some sort of forum? I'm not trying to create work, but is there a gap there? Could we be getting more continuous qualitative input that we could generate some sort of indicator or feedback from? But in terms of quantitative on the business side, I thought about, is there any kind of proxy indicator around the integration of food safety considerations within businesses? So how are businesses of different sizes taking steps to minimise risks around hygiene, around standards, around allergens? So is there something we could develop there? Equally, what percentage of businesses are satisfied with the processes and services from their local authority? We look at local authorities and compliance and inspection rates, but is the business feedback on their experience something that we could try and track? two other indicators which are less business focused, but cost per service, this is something that government does and other regulators do. So official controls could be one example. What's the sort of value for public money around the official control service that we deliver and other programmes of work? And then finally, this one will sort of play in more to the market authorisation points, but application processing times, is that something that we could start to monitor, particularly as we start to evolve and modernise our system? That's it.
Wow, plenty for you to think about there, Sam. Mark?
Well, I'm going to be very brief. I wanted to focus on the trust issue because that's the one we're specifically asked to comment on the actions to. We did hear at the business committee something around, and I can't remember the detail, Tim might remember better than me, around some of the communications and messaging. And I think there was a bit of a blip in the way we collect data around that. But so much of the element of trust in us as an organisation, which is so critical to us then being able to influence others, is based on the message we put out and how that's received by both consumers and businesses. So I just wanted to reflect on that. I think these two actions on here are very sensible. I do think there is that issue around, are we in a blip or a trend? I wouldn't want us to get deeply into a trend before we've done anything, though. So I do think now's the time to start thinking about this, but also start to think about what the messages we put out are and what the balance between warning people of the issues and reassuring people about the work that we put into preventing those issues. The warnings are on the basis that the issues and incidents are the rarity. That's possibly why they hit the news better. But how much effort do we put into reassuring people about the quality of the system that's in place to prevent those issues?
Thank you. And Justin?
Thank you. So I think, and not to reiterate too much of what people have said before, I do think there's a bit about how the trust tracker is presented to correlate with when we know there have been high-profile incidents that have picked up the national news or not, because that makes quite a big difference of, if people aren't aware that of the day-to-day stuff that goes on that actually is saving lives every day, and the incidents which we are managing really effectively, very quickly before any deaths happened. And Emily, when she gave us an update at the beginning, highlighted the two current incidents where there have been deaths associated, and the FSA is quite visible. Certainly in my social media feeds, I can see the product recalls, etc. But if we have those kind of dotted onto that graph, it will allow us to better understand the trend behaviour, because I think Mark's point was there as well around the public understand best what we do on safety when something goes wrong, unfortunately. And it is always a hard challenge to explain and justify the things that didn't happen because of all the work we do. And so helping, I think, through the comms review that's suggested to kind of consider a bit about that. And also, I think, how we conceptualise the food risks for the public. I think risk is a really difficult language to communicate to people. We certainly learnt that in a health perspective on COVID, trying to put it in ways that people understand what is the risk compared to being hit crossing the street, for example, things that are in their everyday lives, I think is key. I do agree with Hayley, the point about the missing voice of business in England, and whether there's a mechanism to kind of review that a little bit and move that forward. And then in the final bit I wanted to raise about that ambition 3, I think this is something that I think it was Rihanna pointed out, the opportunity of the devolves and the different powers gives us an opportunity to explore what kind of metrics could help us track understanding and movement in that space. And post new government, that may change as well in England. So I think it isn't, my concern at the moment is kind of where's the action in that bit around starting to develop indicators and using the examples a bit more clearly in the devolve to start to pull together, because I think at the moment it is the poorer cousin of the other two.
Okay, thank you very much. Fiona.
Thank you, Susan. It was just to pick up on the comms again. It's a hot topic this morning. I mean, I think we're doing some really good comms, and we're starting to really build effective communications through the partner networks that you're establishing. I'm interested to know how we can do more of that, particularly around successes. And I'm thinking, for example, if we're getting wins on the ground through local authority investigations or through port health authority activity, or even non-official points of border control, how can we let the public know that things have been apprehended before a point where they become a problem? I think those help to build a business reputation, that our businesses are regulated effectively, and that plays into anything that we do overseas. It's really, really important for our reputation abroad. But it also builds trust in our system back into the consumer side. So that's a question going forward, how we can do more of that.
Thank you. Okay, Katie, and well, actually Margaret, then Katie. And then I am going to wrap this session up.
Yeah, I was hoping it would come up earlier, it didn't. Comms do a good job. I think they're sometimes restricted by pressure from elsewhere in government, for example, or political pressure. I think we have to resist that where we possibly can and be as strong as we possibly can, because we cannot maintain trust if we're not transparent. Our strategic plan, our key priority, and I think the only way ultimately to keep public trust is to ensure that we keep the public convinced that we will always, without fail, put the safety of our consumers before the commercial interests and pressure from industry. And we need to just keep that thought underlying everything we do.
Katie.
Just a quick framing point before Sam or indeed Claire pick up those points. But I would just be cautious. We've had lots of suggestions about indicators. And we had quite a discussion about a year ago when we set these ones about picking some high-level ones that would enable us to just take a moment to look at the food system and say, is it going in the right direction? Is our attention in the right places, or should we be shifting? There are lots of other things we can use to tell us whether we're doing a good job, and we do use a lot of those at Business Committee, and we'll definitely take all those suggestions. But I think I'd be keen to keep a high level set for that kind of conversation.
Thanks, Katie. I'd completely endorse that. I mean, I think actually many of these indicators are really good ideas, and I think we should think about as we're evolving the performance metrics, because they relate to individual bits of the business rather than this high-level thing. But I think that's been a helpful discussion about indicators. It seems to me that we also we need to focus on the trust issue and how the comms relates to that. This isn't our moment to review our comms strategy. I think there are some interesting debates about whether incidents increase or decrease trust, and maybe that hinges on the way that's communicated. Why don't Emily? I mean, lots of this also really is, as we've said, about how the FSA is performing as a whole. I just wonder if you want to have any reflections, having seen this as Chief Exec, and then we might come over to Sam just to...
Thank you. I mean, Katie's made the points I wanted to make on indicators. There's based on what Anthony was saying that Northern Ireland had raised, there is a question for us about prioritisation, isn't there? So are we doing the right things in the right way? And the question of sort of how much balance we've got between the work on food that's healthier and more sustainable, as opposed to the work that's on that's safe food and food standards. And I guess all I wanted to say was, I think we, as the board know, over a couple of years, we have had to prioritise effort into certain aspects of food safety and standards for the whole organisation, particularly because of the Brexit context that we've been in, and then, of course, the precision breeding work that came along last year. And we may find again after an election that there is also there are changes that a government may wish to make in our relationship with other parts of the world and sanitary and phytosanitary standards. So there is a lot of work to do there, and resourcing is often stretched, particularly in the policy space. That said, I think the steer that you have given us on healthier and sustainable food does make quite a difference to the way that the organisation attends to that. And there's a lot of pride in the organisation for the work that we're able to do, for example, through the regulated product service or on food contact materials and elsewhere, where we think our work does make a difference to those outcomes. And particularly in Northern Ireland, there's a huge amount of passion for our work on dietary health, which fortunately is directly funded by the Northern Ireland Executive and not subjected in the same way to our Westminster money. On the question of trust in us, so I do think it's right that we treat that as a top indicator at strategic level, because if people trust us and the FSA, then they have more trust in the food system. And trust is the currency, frankly, that leads to growth for the industry and also leads to confidence overall in our food. So I think the trust in us is a really key thing. And we had a good discussion at Business Committee about that indicator, which we were able to give a bit more detail on. What we're doing, we don't know yet if it's a trend. It almost doesn't matter. We need to double our efforts in our communication about what we do to make sure people do trust us. And Claire has been thinking hard about how we get more visibility, including for the things that seem routine, like the food hygiene ratings system, where we do get a lot of attention and visibility across the board, but also how we deal with incidents and our proactivity in that space. And then I guess overall, my sense is that the FSA is making a difference in the right way that the board would like on those questions of food safety and standards. If we weren't here, the system would be worse, and I think there would be poorer behaviour, and we make a big difference with actually, compared to some other regulators and some other industries, a relatively modest budget to do that.
Thank you. Sam, what are your reflections, having heard some of those points?
Yeah, thank you. So I think there was kind of three broad themes of questions that came up. So the Northern Ireland one and our priorities and our focus on Pillar 3, and I think I've got nothing to add to what Emily said to that. You maybe won't be too surprised. I think she answered it very, very well. The issue of trust, and I think the point I'd say is it may be a blip, it may be the start of a trend. We don't want to wait, so we want to start to look at it, but start to dip our toe into that. And I don't know, Claire, whether you want to come in on anything more on trust to add to that now before I go to the third one.
Thank you very much. Sam, yes, I just wanted to sort of build on what Emily said about the work that we're doing in communications, thinking about how we can use the way we communicate to build trust. 4 or 5 years ago, the FSA did some research into what drives trust, and that research showed that it's things like familiarity, consistency, perceptions of honesty, those sorts of factors. And so, as Emily has said, we are really working hard to make sure that that familiarity comes through the things that we do, that where people kind of interact with our work, so the food hygiene rating system, the work that we do on incidents and things like that. And Rhiann, building on what you were talking about, case studies and stories, we're really thinking about how we can humanise the work that we do. So, for example, we're looking at how we can use video more, because actually that's such a compelling way of telling those kinds of stories. The other thing that I would just say is also we are looking at how we communicate during incidents and making sure that we can grow the reach of people that we reach through our incident communication, particularly thinking about groups that are vulnerable in that context. And then, Fiona, just building on the partnership work, I completely agree with you. That is so fundamental to us, not only in terms of helping us reach different audiences, but I think also in terms of enhancing our credibility as a sort of trusted brand. So that's something that we're very much looking at. And then if I could just come back to Margaret's point as well about safety, absolutely right. We have been doing some work across different areas of the FSA's work to think about what are the messages that we really need to get across. And overwhelmingly, we're landing again and again on safety. And it's a really useful reminder that although we can get caught up in process in some of the discussions we have internally, actually what's important for the public is that safety message.
And then,
Sam, you had a final bit.
Yeah, so the third thing was about the business feedback that we might receive. And I think, so we have a small and micro business survey that's in the paper, it's Para 2.9, that shows our levels are maintained really high. That is 98% recognition, which I think is really strong. I think your second point around where we're providing services to business, be it on authorisations or other areas, or even the conversations that you might hear about on the ABC programme in September, they can start to become really important bits of feedback about how we are performing to business in terms of their expectations of us. That's slightly different to their trust in our decision making, but I think they might start to lend some really interesting and useful indicators about where they see our performance and how we can look to improve and balance that against taking the right time to make decisions, I guess.
Again, that's really the difference between the performance indicators and the strategic indicators. But I think it is a fair point that we should not only just be looking at judging our own performance, but asking other people what they think of our performance. I haven't heard anything which suggests to me that we're not broadly on track. So I think that's great work. It will be good to see how this report evolves. As we said at the start, this is the first time we've looked at it in this way. So I think it will be helpful to build this over time. And I think Margaret in a way made the key point that all of this, our performance really hinges on: are we doing what consumers want us to do? Are we living up to that statutory responsibility to be the voice of consumers in food policy? And if we get that right, then we're performing well. So because everybody does want a food system that's first and foremost safe, but increasingly they also want a food system which enables them to achieve a healthier, more sustainable diet too. And I think that that's what we need to be working to achieve through our own actions and through influencing others. Great, thank you very much. Good to see things in general are in good order, and that people are paying sufficient attention to those things which might not be exactly where we'd want them to be. So thank you to not just Sam and the team for putting the report together, but really for everybody that sort of works day in, day out on all of this. And on that note, I think everybody here has worked very hard and we deserve a short break. So let's stop there. I think there's coffee outside, and we will resume again in 20 minutes, so at 11:05. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everybody, and we're into the second half of the board meeting today, and we're going to start with the annual report from the Incidents and Resilience team. So incident management is, of course, a primary function of the FSA, and the work of this team in leading the management of food incidents and outbreaks, and indeed the other work they do in trying to prevent them happening in the first place, is absolutely fundamental to ensuring that the public is protected. As we heard in Emily's report, the team are even busier than usual at the moment. So I'm very grateful to them for putting this report together, and also that Darren Whitby has joined us in person today. I know he's been handling quite a lot of work, extra work just recently. This is the annual update, and I think it's important we remember that, and we really take a sort of high-level view of the work of the FSA in this area. But of course, I'm imagining there may well be some specific questions about recent incidents, so we'll have a few moments to talk about that. I'm also conscious that incidents have been mentioned in the first half of this meeting, and so we'll try and pick up on some of those comments as well. But for now, Darren, why don't I hand over to you? And I think is Jodie Wild is also joining us as well. Jodie's the head of the incidents unit. She's online, and perhaps you can just sort of summarise some of the key points in the paper. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. Yes, this paper is delivered annually to show the work of the Incidents and Resilience Unit, and there are just a few themes that I want to highlight. The paper relays the end-to-end incidents process and where the unit drives impact and leadership, for example, with industry engagement, with root cause analysis, and across FSA and wider coordination. There are also elements where the incidents unit may feature but don't necessarily own, so things like the LA resourcing challenges, BTOM and lab capacity. think it's key to note that whilst there is a reported decrease in incidents in terms of numbers, the impacts on the unit still remain like previous years. This is largely due to incident complexity, increase in intelligence, data and whole genome sequencing, and that can mean longer investigation times and sometimes longer incident management. So just to give a couple of examples, sometimes the speed at which LAs respond to our requests may add additional time, or possibly the need to investigate some of the complex webs of food chain supply that might need sort of investigating. That complexity is also science and lab-based. We know more, we receive more lab results, and therefore we're processing more. That's giving us better evidence, but it also is increasing the challenge. Partnership working is key across all the nations and incidents team, as well as sort of externally with industry and across government. We're relying on our good relationships to ensure the timeliness of incidents management and communications. And we're working to build these so that trust is maintained when tested during a response, but we do get out what we're putting in. BTOM preparation is also included in that partnership working, and we've touched on that already. The data is in its infancy, but we are capturing it, and we continue to assess those impacts in terms of incident numbers as those controls are increased. So to approach these evolving areas, we're working on an incidents development programme to ensure that smarter ways of working to develop, modernise and deliver suitable tools and systems to support the advisors and ensure consumer protection. Prioritisation is noted in the paper as well as part of our capacity and smarter working. So we're doing a daily assessment and triage of each reported concern. We work across all the nations to ensure that we share cover and our concerns. And then we assess which incidents are what we would consider to be sort of true incidents, and which perhaps some should not perhaps be taken forward by the incidents team. And then also ensuring that each party in the incidents chain are aware of their responsibilities and what their role is through accountability, working, which then feeds and drives the sort of prevention activity. And then finally, we're working hard to make it better. So the risk and crisis management programme was started last year with implementation this year. The mobilisation surge and the exercising and training are really sort of key parts to that programme. And we've seen some positive delivery of this programme already. And we have used the surge mechanism, which will continue to learn lessons as we go and then review and change to ensure that we've got a resilient and dynamic structure for incident management. Happy to take any questions, thanks.
Thank you very much, Darren. I mean, we heard last year about the complexities of the sort of evolving landscape in relation to incidents, and I think it was really helpful to see the case studies which sort of bring that to life about how this plays out and just makes it that much more tangible. I do think that the management processes in this team have improved substantially over the course of this year, and I certainly feel a lot more confident in that process. I think we've seen in recent incidents that our internal processes are stronger than they were previously, and really good to see that work that's being done on continuous improvement. I'm interested in the way we're using data to improve our capability and capacity. I'm conscious that the issues that we raised earlier, just to remind people the things that are on my list, I think one is the relationship between incidents and trust. Do incidents undermine trust in our ability to keep the system safe, or do they boost trust by understanding that we're managing it? I think it would be helpful to hear any insights on that. We've had a couple of comments about grey market goods and also the comments around incidents at the border, whether we're picking up more things there. So if we put those as starter for 10 on the list of topics. But let me turn to colleagues, and Anthony, I think you wanted to come in, and then Margaret.
I just wanted to reflect the views of NIFAC. They thought this was an excellent paper. They particularly welcomed the analytical nature of the paper. But they had three specific areas they wanted me to raise. The first one, you've already mentioned it there, Darren, was in relation to prevention. And they wanted to say, particularly with reference to Annex C in the paper, how do we use this data for prevention activity and to help industry mitigate against the specific incidence types? So the data's there, but what are we doing with it to actually improve going forward? They also were conscious of the partnership working and how critical it is to what we do, but their question, I think, was, are we always an equal partner? Are other agencies and government departments slightly more in control in terms of approach and direction? And the third one then was the final point that you were making in relation to surge capacity, and they wanted to know how long can an incident go on for in terms of surge capacity before attrition sets in, and is the model of all incidents going through the incidents team the right way to go, or is there a sort of a tiered system that you can then manage? So you've touched on all of those points a little, but those were just the queries from NIFAC.
Thanks, Anthony. I'm going to go to Margaret now, who's actually our lead on board member on incidents, and huge thanks to Margaret, who's contributed an enormous amount of time into helping the team work on the incident management plan this year.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Darren and Jodie. You're so busy at the moment, and you're doing a fantastic job, I think. On surge, since you've just raised that, for people who don't understand, it means when they ask other people in the FSA who to volunteer to do their day job and help with an incident when there are a lot of incidents and they need extra people. Question on surge is, do we have enough people to deal with multiple serious incidents? We're obviously okay at the moment, but we're pretty high if it went any higher. Second one, grey goods. Coming in mainly from the US, you say they make up 5% of incidents in the past year. And we heard about this when we went, Rian and me, when we went up to the Port of Liverpool. These are coming in and they're bypassing border controls, or they're coming in at the wrong ports or whatever. They're not being landed through official channels. And yet we can see, if you walk down Oxford Street or big streets in all our large cities, you can buy these goods. How they're getting in, what can we do about that? And then we no longer get real-time information on certain risks and incidents post-EU exit, which means we're getting intelligence sometimes a little bit late. How significant is the problem? I know that you've been really working on that. And then my final question, fantastic work that you've done on root cause analysis, on the various committees. I know Jodie sits on the working groups with FSS and industry and the food industry liaison group, and working on improving the quality of data to improve end-to-end journey of incident management. What this paper doesn't cover, because it's not part of the remit, I totally understand that, is what we do with lessons learned post an incident to ensure that weaknesses and mistakes aren't repeated. So what work is in progress to ensure we have fit-for-purpose SOPs and procedures so everyone involved knows what's expected, what the lines of management and communications post-incidents are. So a lot of questions there.
Thank you. Quite a list. Rian.
Just one from myself. Following up from the WFAC meeting last week, just reflecting, we talked quite a bit about the root cause analysis, so we really welcomed the illustrations of those in the document. So that was really helpful. And I think our points were similar to the one Margaret's just made, in the sense of what are we doing? So not for now, but for a later date. What are we doing? It'd be really interesting to know how we're disseminating those analyses to industry, and there's an example in there for one, because for us it was about resilience. So how can we make our food businesses more resilient by learning from these lessons, and what more can we do? And there's a task in there, I guess, an offer from WFAC, and I'm sure NIFAC would be the same. It's, how can we collaborate to get some of this root cause analysis out regionally to best effect, because some of these businesses are quite small. We can't have them reinventing wheels. We've got to get them to understand the right ways to work. So an offer there, I think.
Thank you. Darren, do you want to come back on some of those points?
Yeah, can do. Thank you. So I'll probably start with the root cause analysis, since that was last mentioned and mentioned on a few of them. As mentioned in the paper, what the team have done, the prevention team, is help facilitate and set up an industry working group, which we've got an independent chair that's kindly took that on with a lot of industry background. And the hope is that the comments that were made is exactly the area that we're looking to progress, is how can we get that feedback loop going better with industry. I have quite a sort of number of sort of relationship management type conversations with the large retailers, and they're very sort of keen to explore this further. One, so that they can learn, and also their suppliers and manufacturers, so this becomes a more sort of standard industry approach. Some of the data that was mentioned in the paper about the volumes of root cause analysis that we're getting back, we'd like to see that more. We'd like to see that become the norm, so that you can actually get the value out of that data. So it's been progressing well this year, but I think there's a lot to do, and I'm more than happy to sort of get some help and support in that messaging around root cause analysis. Thank you. Just the point around the borders, as I mentioned in the intro, we've not seen a large sort of impact of incidents at the borders, but I don't know whether, Angela, you could just perhaps give us a little bit on that sort of that phased approach and where we anticipate seeing change.
So I think Darren's right. As I mentioned earlier to the board, there's going to be a graduated approach to implementation. And in answer, it relates part to Mark's question initially around monitoring. So part of what we're doing with DEFRA is we are feeding into DEFRA the data we want to collect to better understand what we learn after each tranche is introduced. That will help us to try and monitor impact, help us gear up for potential incidents, what that means for non-compliance versus deliberate avoidance. So that's part of the ongoing work as we better understand the implications of BTOM coming in. Thank you.
Thank you. So one of the other points that was raised by a number of people was around the surge. So in answer to those questions, at the moment we've got a setup of surge response, which is serving its purpose, as it says. But the risk and crisis management programme is actually working on a more improved structure. And through the programme board, we're looking at how we can make that more robust, and it will meet the needs of the incident response that we're going to be doing. At the moment, for our current setup, we have around 40 people that are available and ready to go. There are other people that we know of in the business that have supported us in the past, which we're more than happy to call upon as and when we need them. But what we do see is as part of that mobilisation work stream, we will have a more robust approach and system of calling people in, and then the supporting training and exercising that will go with it, so people are prepared to stand up when we're sort of running concurrent incidents.
Darren, I think I'm just going to ask Junior, I think wants to come in on this.
Can I just build on that surge capacity? It was a really important point here, because I am the Strategic Incident Director for the agency, but over the last year, a number of senior executives have stepped into that senior executive incident director role. So we've started to actually build our own senior capacity in that space. And again, like the same with our deputy directors who would normally chair our incident management group. We've got about 6 of those now out of the 12 that we've identified that are now operationally ready to actually step into that as well.
That's great. I think on surge, this also links to prioritisation, which you mentioned briefly, because how much surge capacity you need depends on where you set your prioritisation boundaries. And it would be good to hear a little bit more about that, I think, because at one level one might instinctively think, well, every incident, is a priority, but clearly some are more serious than others. And I think it'd be helpful for the board to understand the processes, the thinking that informs that prioritisation.
Well, I'll probably pass to Jodie on this, because this is sort of a key part of Jodie's role. So,
okay.
Jodie, you're on.
Jodie, you're on.
By all means, thanks, Darren. Yes, good morning, everyone. It is a really daily active territory at the moment. Obviously, it's been noted a number of times that we are quite exceptionally busy currently. The triage process is very much that low, medium and high in terms of impacts, scale, regionality, etc. We are looking at implementing changes to what we do, and it really goes back to sort of Margaret's point about lessons learned as well. We are capturing those on a daily basis and looking at how we can evolve that picture to ensure that there's that protection of all concerned and ensuring the right people are addressing the right things. I think it's sort of noting that surge capacity and capability as well. We do have a large number ready and able to go. Obviously, everyone has different skills, different availability, and obviously there are wider points that people have to respond to across the FSA. So it's very key that we address and it's very active on that daily basis to address who's available, what is the primary points of concern for that day, as that can evolve across a day. So we really do. We have sort of meetings twice a day in terms of that management of who takes what on and should we have enough capacity.
So, Jodie, I'm reassured that you recognise it's important and that you're doing it. I'm still not sure I'm terribly clear on how the prioritisation is done, but maybe we could take this conversation offline, and perhaps if I can ask Margaret just to pick this up, just so that the board is kind of reassured that sensible decisions are being made, because, it also really impacts into the wider agency as well, because it's about the priorities there, and, there are food safety issues in other places too. So I think that maybe is just one final bit in our incident function I'd just like a bit more reassurance on. Darren, you didn't mention grey market goods, so that's a sort of key point as well. Katie, did you want to come in specifically on that point about prioritisation? Okay. Oh no. Okay. All right. Grey market. Katie.
I was going to say something about grey market goods. And this isn't one of those issues that I think really illustrates the interrelation between the work that the incidents team does, the NFCU, and also my team in regulatory compliance. So this isn't a new thing. It's something that local authorities have been telling us they're worried about for some years. Mark will know this. And we're talking here about products like sweets and drinks, which are widely sold and consumed in countries like the United States, but they don't meet our standards because the level of additives are too high or they're undisclosed ingredients or something. So it's sort of been a continual worry. Mark is right that it would be great if these were all picked up at the border. They tend to be in the categories that have lower levels of checks because they are kind of shelf-stable, products of non-animal origin. And also, they're not just coming through big importers. People are getting them by post or courier and so on. So there are lots of routes in. So the primary effort at tackling them tends to be in inland in trading standards teams. And obviously, we've seen a reduction in resource there massively over the last decade. So the thing we've done, which is in Emily's report, is not instead of border checks, but in addition, trying as many different routes as we can to tackle this problem, which is identifying the biggest importers who may not even know that they're doing something illegal or may not be paying enough attention to it, and telling them and writing to them. But this is, I think, a really good illustration of what the new food standards model ought to be helping us to do, because then we're putting together the intelligence and insight we're getting through local authorities and all the different sources, including incidents. And then the food standards team in my area working with individual local authorities to try and help direct their activity where we know there are problems.
Great, thank you. Mark, did you want to come back on that?
Just one question, just picking up on something Katie's just said there, because obviously I'm very aware of the inland work in this, and I know the FSA has supported lots of local authorities in that work, which they've really valued and appreciated. Katie, you mentioned the fact that these goods are in a category which is low risk. If we're now setting the risks as controlling our own borders, is that something we should be looking at?
Thanks, Mark. So one of the things we are looking at is how we can better control these goods. one aspect is, yes, the Borders target operating model. The other aspect is whether there is some way legally that they can come into the category of high-risk foods not of animal origin, which we also control. So these are ongoing conversations about how we better control it. So we've identified it. We're trying to find a way to deal with it.
Okay, thank you. Fiona.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. I just wanted to ask about the Food Industry Liaison Group. That came up last year in Operation Hawk, and it seems that since then there's been much more engagement with it. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and how perhaps it's expanded its reach, because my memory was that it only dealt directly with some of the larger players in the industry, but obviously it's got the potential to go much wider than that. And deal with some of these awareness issues that we've just been talking about.
Yeah, of course, thanks. It's the FILG, as we refer to it, has expanded. What we're getting more of now is some of the trade associations stepping forward, seeing that as a forum where they can share information with us. So it's about developing a two-way conversation. I still think there's probably work to be done in that sort of smaller sector, the smaller businesses, because they may not necessarily engage as much with some of the trade bodies. But it's an area that we've actively looking at with the prevention team and sort of seeking out sort of better relationships with some of the smaller trade bodies to try and just understand, are we getting the reach and the conversations about communications inwards and outwards into our work, particularly in that prevention space.
Margaret, did you want to add to this?
No, just that I asked a question about intelligence post-EU exit. I don't know whether there's anything you need to add.
I was wondering if I could pick that one up on the data point. So, yes, thank you, Margaret. I think you're referring to, since we left the EU, there's the lack of access to all of the RASIF data in real time. So that happened a long time ago, and what we did was to develop a system that can access directly individual countries' different sources of data. And overall, I think that is well established. I think it is working well. There may be some things that might be missed, but equally well, I think we now see some things that we might not have seen before in the past. So overall, I don't think it's a significant concern to us. And a lot of that other RASIF data does follow on slightly later. We do monitor all of that just to make sure that it still is as good as it can be. So as I say, it's been in place for a couple of years now.
Thank you. I think that's been a pretty good run round most of the points that were raised. The one that we haven't picked up on is, I think it was Anthony's initial point was about our partnership work, or somebody's point about how and when we lead on these things. And I wonder if you might sort of combine that by just telling us the latest on the sort of very active incidents that are ongoing at the moment, particularly the E. coli one. And firstly, I'm grateful to the updates the board's had on that. I think we've been kept very well informed, and that's been great. But maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about how that partnership arrangements are working, and the more generic point about how and when we who leads on these things.
Yeah, of course. Generically, I would say it's an area that's under sort of constant evolution across different government departments. We do work quite closely and regularly with UK HSA, considering the public health and food safety aspects. We want similar things, but we've got different lead responsibilities. So I think it's one that we're keeping under review. We're engaging at a more senior level with members of the senior team in UK HSA to try and understand that lead role perspective. I think these things have to be dynamic. Using the E. coli one as a sort of particular sort of reference point, this started out very much and still is very much in that public health space. But clearly, as we get into food being that source, the communication plans that go around it, some of the food safety actions that are required, then sort of generates a conversation around who then takes that lead responsibility. What we'd like is that as quick as these things are appearing, we're getting to the point of de-escalation. So sometimes it's almost a moot point to say, do we do we leave it with a particular lead, or do we share that lead responsibility? What we did do I think it was last year, was when we had an issue around listeria in smoked fish. We had an ongoing dialogue with our colleagues in Food Standards Scotland around who led on that particular one. We've both got food safety remits, admittedly, but it was about who was the most appropriate authority to be leading to deliver to best effect. So it's very much a dynamic thing, but I do think there's probably a little bit of more work that's required, particularly in the UK HSA space from our point of view going forward.
And just to build on that, Chair, and just to build on that, so we've set up conversations to actually begin working some of that detail through with UK HSA in particular.
Great, good to hear that, and thank you again for all the very current work that's going on and everything else you do during the year. That's great. Really good to hear how this has come on over the last year. As I said at the start, I feel a lot more confident we're in a better place, and it's good that we're now at the stage where we really can start to be in this sort of continuous improvement model, but building from a solid position. So thank you for that. I think that closes this item. So thank you, Darren. We'll let you get back to the day job. And we'll move on to the next item, which is a paper on the market authorisations. So previously, we've described this as our regulated products service, but in discussion with some stakeholders, it became clear that this actually wasn't very clear what we were talking about. And I hope that the term market authorisations fits better with the descriptions that are used by other regulators who are approving products as being suitable to enter the market. For us, it's a process to check that new foods are safe, and that really is at the heart of what we do. So board members will remember we had a really good discussion back in March, and we agreed at that point that the FSA should prioritise some initial reforms to the service by removing the requirement for renewals on some categories and also the need for statutory instruments. And so this paper gives you an update on that, which of course has been affected by the general election. We also asked officials to do some very serious thinking about wider long-term reforms, and we set some general principles for that service, ensuring, as I said, that safety really underpins the whole of that approach. I was hoping that we would be able to discuss those reform proposals today, but as I mentioned at the start, we didn't feel that was appropriate, given that stakeholders haven't had an opportunity to see the papers in advance. And so what I was suggesting we do, since the team have been doing a lot of work on this, I thought it was helpful for you to see where things are at, to provide a little bit of a steer to officials about the direction of travel. We obviously welcome comments from people when they do see the papers, but there will be this will come to us in the autumn as a formal board paper for decisions. So this really is it's sort of a status update, I suppose, and for us to provide any steer. But it may be, famous last words, it may be this is a relatively short item, because I hope that this really just fills out a little bit of detail of things we've discussed previously. So Peter is our Deputy Director for Regulatory Services, and great to have you here with us in North Wales, Peter.
Thank you, Susan, and good morning, everyone. So I'll briefly set out the key points in the paper and then welcome comments from board members. At the previous meeting, as Susan referred to in March, we discussed our proposals to remove the renewals and SI requirements associated with market authorisations. And very soon after this, we launched a consultation on these proposals in early April, which closed earlier this month. And so once the Westminster government is in place after the election, we want to work with them to bring forward these reforms as soon as possible. And so today, the board is invited to note the progress on initial reforms. As Susan has referred to, the board also requested an outline of the potential wider long-term reforms, and so the main body of today's paper sets up primarily the current deficiencies in the system and makes the case for change, we hope. And then in section 4, we just touch on our headline vision and proposals for the modernised system, which is that we envisage a system which upholds standards while modernising the system to be effective, proportionate and transparent, where products are safe by design. And you'll note that our proposals include several references to stakeholders such as applicants, other regulators, and working across the 4 nations. And we're really keen to convey a strong sense that this reform is a collective challenge which will need people outside the FSA to work with us if we want to succeed. And so the board is invited to discuss our proposed vision for the service, and I'll now hand back to the chair.
Thank you very much. So, questions or comments? I know that NIFAC and WFAC have had sort of deep dive meetings on regulatory reform, so I don't know if Rhian and Anthony have any comments to pass on at this stage.
Thank you, Susan. Just a general comment that we've had lots of time as WFAC to look at this topic in a themed meeting previously and recently, well, last week, so thank you for that again. No, we're very supportive of what we see in there, and it very much echoes our thoughts as they've been developing through the last months. I think you've set out quite well, what the deficiencies are in the system, and the language we're using now is easier to get your head around. We felt that at WFAC last week. Market authorisation feels like better language. So no, just very supportive.
Great. Thank you. Anthony, anything specific to add? I'm conscious.
Again, just very supportive of the paper. 2 points that NIFAC were slightly, wanted me to make. One was just a concern continually about divergence and making sure that we don't get left out there. And the second one was to welcome the pre-application support and the suggestion that we might want to look at areas such as Innovate UK have done this and done it well and badly in the same way. So just those 2 points.
Thank you. Let me open more generally. David.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's an excellent paper. I like the principles set out in Annex A, which I fully support, and I like the draft proposals in 4.3. And I look forward to getting the details of it in due course in September. And in the meantime, I'd like officials just to crack on and give us the full works when we're next able to discuss it properly.
Thank you. Hayley and Mark.
Thank you. Just to echo that, I think I do agree with the assessment of the problem, and I think the vision is absolutely right. So hopefully, incoming ministers will also agree with the logic and the evidence behind those shorter-term reforms, because they're absolutely key, and the longer-term vision is absolutely right. I think it's very important that we stick to an ambitious timescale, because obviously PB is coming online, and we don't want to set that up to fail by putting it into a system that isn't capable of handling it. So yeah, very supportive.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. Likewise, very supportive. I think this has moved an awfully long way since we started discussing it, and I think it's very positive. I do think we need to be really focused on what our role in this is going forwards, and that we don't become that we don't get too close to industry in trying to help them through the process. That the second principle I think on the list is about representing consumer interests. We are the regulator. We shouldn't be the people telling business how to do their business. And interestingly, on that note, we heard last night from a couple of visiting speakers around, I think they were called innovation hubs or something in Wales. They're clearly really good practice. They would really work well in this space, and it would be something that would be very interesting for other parts of the country that we represent to look at.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting and really important point. It's businesses' responsibility to ensure their food is safe, and it's we're there to provide the assurance and the checks on behalf of consumers. And so the question of how much we help and support industry is a tricky one. Clearly, it makes our life easier if they're producing the right dossiers. It's clearly important we get the guidance right. But then I think the idea of having third parties who really support them in those applications rather than us is probably quite an important distinction. I agree with you. We've talked about the food technology centres here in Wales, and I know some of the board went to visit yesterday. I think there is a huge opportunity for them there, and there isn't a similar structure in England, but actually there are other institutes and organisations that could fulfil that role. It may be there's a train the trainer thing we can do rather than feeling like it's our job to do it directly. Tim.
Thank you. Yeah, this is a really welcome paper, I think. And I totally agree with the comments that have just been made. the responsibility has to be with industry in terms of the integrity, safety and marketability of their goods. That's not our job. Our job is directly towards the consumer. But I think what is important for industry, that this now, and the language you're using, is become a recognisable function from the industry perspective. Market authorisation, as a term meaning a gateway to the market, is used for consumer products, licenses to operate, drug and healthcare products, and this brings the whole concept of novel foods coming to the market into that regulatory repertoire. And I think that's important for us as an organisation in terms of people perceiving what we do. So the direction of travel is welcome. Clearly, there is a lot to do. And also to contextualise that within aspirations, both from a new government, but also from consumers' changed expectations. And not to forget that and maybe tidal wave is a bit melodramatic, but there is an awful lot of new products on technology coming our way that use not just in a single technology, but in composite ways that are really going to challenge some of the important science base we have. So that's why when we were having the conversation with Robin earlier, it's very important to contextualise one with the other, and I really look forward to how we progress this.
Great, thank you. In the interest of time, I'm going to close this this conversation now because it will come back later. Peter, you've heard the general support for this, a few few bits of advice and suggestions. I would note that there is a lot of work to be done here, and I think there are two important factors which are going to be consequential for us. One will be the attitudes and openness of the new government to moving in this direction. I think there's a good case for it, but they may have other priorities. And the second, and the reason is around the cost of doing this. Change often comes at a price initially, and whilst this might deliver us a better service in the end, the effort and investment that's going to have to go in to develop this service at the same time as running the service we've already got should not be underestimated. So I think that's something which is going to impact on our decision making as well. But as and when the money is available, I want us to be absolutely ready to make the very, very best use of it. So I'm keen to urge this work onwards, really. Any final comments, Rebecca or Peter, that you want to make on this? If not, let me just say thank you for all the work that's gone on. These are great. Also, at the Business Committee, we looked at the routine performance of the regulated products service. Absolutely delighted to see that the number of risk assessments that are coming through now is really accelerating, as was predicted. But I think the whole board should be reassured that that is happening, and that reflects both increased recruitment into CERD, but also people being trained up and able to do that. So I think we are in a very, very much better position all round in this area, both in the current delivery, still a long way to go, but actually really progressing well, and in the plans for reform. So a really big thank you to the teams working on this. I really do know it's been a very, very tough year for you, and I think we're in so much better a place, and really wanted to acknowledge that. Thank you. Okay, we're a little bit behind time, and I noticed for some reason this next item, which is the report from the Director from Northern Ireland, is only slated for 10 minutes, which seems a little bit mean. We are a bit short of time, but if it overruns slightly, Andy, that's fine. I apologise, I don't quite know how that happened. But anyway, delighted to welcome you here to North Wales and to hear about the work that is happening in Northern Ireland.
We can keep it to 5 minutes, Chair, if you need. That's grand. Bora da, I think we're still within time. It's good to be here, folks, and appreciate your time. The paper is hopefully self-explanatory. Just wanted to draw out a few elements of the paper, just what's specific to Northern Ireland and our footprint there. And more specifically, since I last spoke to you last June, a lot happens in Northern Ireland in 12 months, so to draw out some of those things first. So last October, in October 23, what's commonly known as the Red and Green Lane went live through the Northern Ireland points of entry under the Windsor Framework Arrangements. So we're seeing that embedded now. We're seeing the smooth flow of trade and food, agri-food, through UK under those arrangements. That's positive. As you know, we apply EU rules in Northern Ireland, and Windsor Framework just remains front and central in everything the Northern Ireland team does, and that includes divergence, been mentioned today already. We track that closely with structures in place to manage it. and as the paper notes, it's mostly been technical to date, but we remain alive to that issue. Other Windsor Framework work streams that the team take forward include the SPS facilities that are due to come into operation by July next year. We're working closely with District Council and DAERA portal teams on that programme of work. And Windsor Framework implementation regulations come into effect in April this year, and those confer concurrent powers on ministers of the Crown to exercise any powers that were held by a Northern Ireland minister, department or competent authority. And that's a big shift in the operating context for Northern Ireland. So we're going to be working with the incoming administration and a number of other Windsor framework arrangements, such as the introduction of charging for red lane movements, as touched upon in the paper. Important for board to note that. The last thing just I would note about all things Windsor Framework is the importance of the relationships and the handling of the political sensitivities. It's a complex operating environment, as you know. Not all district councils, not all communities would be supportive of the arrangements. And our north-south relationship is really key and important for us in the Northern Ireland team, not just for movement of food, but also in how we manage incidents. And our focus, as you'd expect, it's not on the politics, it's on protecting public health. So that's Windsor Framework. The other big change since I last spoke to you is we have Northern Ireland Executive back. No thanks to me, but that came back, re-established in February 24, and that sets a new context for us in FSA in Northern Ireland. Take forward a legislative agenda, particularly on the obesity strategy and the food strategy. So exciting times for the agenda. We've had strong senior engagement as well from the Chair and Chief Executive into those structures, and we'll continue to build on that. One new structure that did come to fruition with the restoration of the Executive was the Windsor Framework Democratic Scrutiny Committee, the DSC as we call it, and that's been set up to consider all new EU legislation noted to it by the UK Government. So we've already provided the committee with written and oral evidence on the EU breakfast directives, and DSC is just going to be a common feature of our work programme going forward. Almost there, Chair. The paper touched on the dietary health agenda, and you'll know the board set a new ambition for us last year. We refocused that work to ensure the ambition was more clearly defined, that allows us to maximise the impact and target our resources more effectively. So I'm keen to hear your reflections on that today, challenges around the work that's been done over the last year and where we want to take that forward. And finally, just to provide assurance to the board on what I probably poorly describe as our business as usual. So our teams are firmly embedded in the relevant work streams right across FSA, just to ensure that we deliver board priorities as the one FSA. So that includes incidents, the food standards and the food hygiene delivery models, the regulated products work, delivery of official controls through the district councils and through our SLA with DAERA. That's always about doing the day job well, which must be our focus. And when I have the mic, just a thanks to my team. I appreciate this time. I only lead the team. I'm thankful for a skilled and highly committed team that work on your behalf for consumers, just ensuring our food's safe. So may I ask of you today is just to note the progress made, comment on the priorities for the incoming months, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Andy, and I really do appreciate the sort of very clear updates and sort of regular commentary I get from you and the team, and indeed from Anthony as well, about the situation in Northern Ireland. It's complicated for those working in it, I'm sure, but it's even more complicated for those of us who are sort of looking at it a few steps removed. So this has been great to hear the implications of that. I also want to thank you for the appearance at the Democratic Scrutiny Committee. Emily mentioned that first time we've been there, and it seemed to me that it was a very a clear presentation of our work, and did give the committee, I hope, confidence in what the FSA is doing. So I'm sure that will stand us in good stead in the future. So thank you for that. On dietary health, I'm slightly conflicted in this with my day job, so I'm going to leave other members of the board to comment on that, except to note that I think the team have really worked hard on this. I think they made a lot of progress this year, and the event that I attended a few months ago, which was mostly around the healthier vending, was very well attended by a really wide range of stakeholders, from consumer groups, from other government departments, and from the industry. and I received a lot of spontaneous feedback from people who were really pleased that the FSA was bringing people together in this way. So, my sense is it's really come together well, and I think there's a good role for us there. Enough from me. Anthony, you chair NIFAC, and yes, thanks to NIFAC for all the contributions they make into this, but what's your general assessment of how it's going in Northern Ireland?
First of all, thank you, Chair, for the input that I think you've also put into Northern Ireland and the focus particularly on the dietary health and sustainability, because we have completely pivoted away from reformulation and things like that, much more into a more focused area, particularly with the vending machines events. I think Andy's paper is great. The one thing I would say about it is that it probably actually undersells the work that actually goes on by the team in Northern Ireland. They deliver all of the standard FSA work right across the piece. But Northern Ireland is a very highly politicised environment, and very small things blow up into very big things very, very quickly, and no pun intended. And I think that Anjali, Andy and the team have really grasped this, really delivered it. The fact that we haven't been in the press that much, the fact that we've stayed out of it, while still bringing in the BTOM, while still bringing in the checks and the controls. The fact is the FSA punch above its weight. We have a very small team of about 80 people, but we punch very much above the weight in Northern Ireland, but we're highly recognised and highly valued, and I think that came across by the DSC when Andy appeared before them. You could actually see that there was confidence. Yes, there was debate, but there was confidence and a great belief. But also the interconnectivity. The Lough Neagh incident in Northern Ireland about a year ago, this time last year, really was massive news. It ran for weeks and weeks, and it is still a big, big issue. It is an issue that will take tens to 20s of years to actually try and deal with. It's nothing that can be done quickly. And Robin's input into that, along with Andy and the team. And what I think it shows is the one FSA approach, the joined-up approach that we have in Northern Ireland. We have that team, but we have the full resources to pull on. So I think the report is excellent. I commend it to the board. But I do think it undersells the actual level of work that's gone on. So I'll shut up at that.
Great, lovely to hear that endorsement. And comments from others looking at this one step removed. Fiona.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you. It's a really good report. I'm just interested to know about the public health programmes that you've been doing. The vending seems like a massive challenge, because I don't use vending machines often because my money so often gets stuck and I can't get the thing at the slot at the bottom. But a lot of the products traditionally that are sold in those are things like chocolate bars. So I'm assuming that the work you did had to look at what's actually stocked and how that's changed consumer behaviour, because the choice there dictates actually what people can buy. But much more importantly, is that something that we could potentially roll out as a pilot in England? Because if it's worked and you've got the evidence that it worked, then it would be a really valuable bit of work that we might be able to use here. And likewise with children's menus. And then just a separate question on BTOM and Windsor Framework. It seems like we're stepping now into the conundrum of that cross flow of all of the different regulations coming into have an impact on how the food industry needs to behave. So do the breakfast directives make a significant difference to what a Northern Ireland producer will have to do in the way that it manufactures and labels? Does that present a barrier to trade into the rest of GB? It's probably not a massive change in terms of the risk profile or whatever of the product. And equally with things like renewals, how do we navigate that? Because it's not it's a short-term issue that will need to be dealt with. So I just wondered if you could talk a bit more about that.
Thanks, Fiona. I should say that when I went to the conference on healthier vending, I discovered that vending has moved well beyond anything I imagined in my experience, and maybe yours, Fiona, to having not only machines which are refrigerated and able to sell cool products, but also ones which actually produce hot products and the sort of ready meals, and even interest in some of the hospitals about replacing particularly their overnight food service with some of these machines. So I think at one level, it sounds like vending is kind of a small issue, but actually it's a growing issue, and it's affecting a much wider range of products. And so I think you're right that it will be something that other parts of the UK will become interested in. Any more comments from others before I go to Andy? I can see Justin as, why don't we come to you, Justin?
Thank you, Susan. I mean, just to build on the vending point, and this is a path well trodden over the years as various initiatives have been tried. And I think the question is how, as this initiative rolls out in Northern Ireland, the actual impact on both purchasing behaviour, but whether there's any wider impact of changing the vending offer plays out. And I think particularly building on what you've said, Susan, I'm very conscious in my local acute trusts have moved away from having a freezer in the mess for the doctors, nurses to access food at night, having a vending machine which will not only distribute it, it will heat it for you in a much more kind of Japanese style that is very integrated in those parts of the world. But I think the question really is, what's the longitudinal assessment of this intervention? Because there have historically been at least 3 or 4 points in policy where vending has been a particular area of interest. Attempts have been made to change the stocking of vending machines, but that has lasted for a limited amount of time, and there's been very little assessment of actually how it's impacted on consumer behaviour, and also how it's impacted on the commercial side of the vending business, which is increasing an area of growth.
Thank you. Any more comments from others? Okay, let me come back to you, Andy, then, just to respond to some of those points.
Sure, yeah.
So I think it's sort of Windsor framework, BTOMI implications, and then the vending project evaluation.
Take the DSC stuff first, and the breakfast directives. Yeah, so the very purpose of the DSC being set up is to assess the impact in communities of EU law applied to Northern Ireland. So they will take a piece of EU law informed to it by the government, make that assessment in terms of evidence from the lead department, and then decide whether to hold an inquiry. If they decide to hold an inquiry and put to the Northern Ireland Assembly that it would be too significant an impact to communities in Northern Ireland, there's that mechanism called the storm and break that could be pulled between the EU and the UKG. So our evidence to the committee in respect of the breakfast directives was we didn't feel there was significant impact from the detail that we knew. I've learned a lot about jam and marmalade in the last few weeks, but what we have in Northern Ireland is probably the manufacturers are artisan in nature. There's probably higher fruit content there, and the breakfast directives themselves gave some innovation as well to industry. So that's with the type of evidence we came, but I would say we'll be up in front of DSC for many EU rules coming in, and that's the type of considerations that'll be there: impacting communities, divergence, trade implications, and there may be some more significant coming forward in the future. In respect of vending, yes, 500,000 vending machines now across the UK, so it is big business, and this can't just be an intervention. So the March event wasn't just an event, and Justin's right, we changed the food offer in the vending machine. That doesn't solve the problem, but it's part of the solution, and we want to make it part of the solution. So it's about that changing the food environment, so reducing the amount of saturated fat, salt and sugar that's on offer. The food on offer to you will be chosen. So it's a phased approach to how we can reduce the levels of that in the food offer. And it's also part of the whole systems approach on the obesity strategy. And that's why it's important now with our ministers back, and it'll breathe life into the obesity strategy and the food strategy. So we'll not be just doing our intervention or policy intervention on our own as the FSA. It'll be contributing to a much bigger picture. The promotions work and the policy development of how promotions would happen in retail in Northern Ireland, taking lessons of what happened in England and what's happening in Wales and Scotland as well, will also be part of that. So we can change the food environment and vending machines, will influence into retail and manufacturers to reduce portion sizes, to reformulate their products. We're already seeing that in terms of some of the offer that's got into vending. But so it wasn't an event in March, is the thing I want to stress. What we're doing now, we've had all the conversations across the 11 district councils to identify pilot sites, and we're commissioning research to baseline the information in those pilot sites to track what we want to see is a change in the nutrient profile of purchase and ensure the trade for the manufacturers remains the case as well. So it's part of a much bigger project across the next number of months. I think I've picked up most of those queries. Okay.
I think so too, and really, really good to hear about that engagement across the food system. And I think this opportunity to make a specific contribution both to the DERA food strategy and the Department of Health obesity strategy means that this particular project also gives us a platform to engage with these departments. And as we all know, if you have a joint thing in common and work together on that, then it just helps to build relationships more generally. So yeah, great work. Thank you to the Dietary Health team. Thanks to the wider Northern Ireland team for all you've done. Ringing endorsement from Anthony, who sees it close up, and thanks on behalf of the board. Very good. So we move now on to some of really the sort of standard reporting items from Business Committee, ARAC and the Food Advisory Committees. And I'm going to start by turning to Tim as Chair of the Business Committee, who met last week, I think.
Yes, thanks, Chair. Yes. You've a paper before you, and I won't go through the detail of the paper, but I will pick out some points, and obviously we can go to questions. I think the first point I wanted to make was just about the style of business of the Business Committee and its focus on business performance. And what was very reassuring, I think, at the last meeting was that was the principal focus about the scrutiny in and around the performance report. And I'll just say a bit more about that in a second. But as a previous chair to ARAC, I'm also mindful that the committee delivers well within its terms of reference and complements ARAC in support to the board. And I think certainly the focus on performance and the operational side of that clearly came to the fore this time. I think I'd like to thank Ruth and the contributing authors for the performance report, because that really assisted our ability to scrutinise and also hopefully to give constructive feedback in the detail around that report. We did focus also on regulated products, and I think we've already covered that in the board today. But we did note that the requirements around the statutory instruments does provide a constraint, but we also noted the increased efficiency in delivery, so that was a very welcome development. We also looked at precision breeding and on its operational performance, and at the moment, of course, we're anticipating how it's going to perform. We did comment back on the need to be much clearer about timetables, particularly around Tier 2. And of course, that feeds into the regulated products conversation we've also had here today. On ops modernisation, we did hear about the accuracy and efficiency of inspection data, and also the proposals around the tender exercise for desktop risk assessments. That's important. I mean, I raised earlier today also the importance around FCI. That's nested within that, and it has implications for other work that we do in and around particularly sort of the meat food chain. And last, I just wanted to say something about the communications, which we picked up on, and Mark commented earlier around the Business Committee. It doesn't bear going back over that conversation, but it is worth saying that, you know, the increase in neutral responses rather than a demonstrable increase in distrust was particularly noted by the committee, and I think it's just important to keep that distinction. So I'll stop there, open it up to any questions through the chair, if I may.
Thank you. I guess this is particularly for those members of the board who are not at the business committee. The papers from that meeting are appended to this report. I don't know if there's anything additional you wanted to ask about, or whether you're content that the business committee are on top of things as it stands. Margaret?
Tim, this is where we get these documents. We were discussing that last night, so that's great. I just hope that you're still keeping an eye on what should be going where, because sometimes I don't quite understand why things are in one committee and why they're not in another. There was discussion on some of the financial side of things and what the NAO is doing, but of course the NAO actually attends in person ARAC, so is there a bit of muddle there? Discussions on things like trust and comms, well, we've just had that discussion here. Is there too much repetition? And the reason I asked that sort of question is actually, is that good use of directors' time? I noticed that also directors have started, I don't know at what point, it may have been going on for years, presenting all their papers at WFAC, you call it, and NIFAC. So they're presenting some of these papers quite a few times. So are we actually being efficient enough? And are we asking our exec to do things they really don't need to be doing 3 or 4 times over? And then the final thing is just keeping an eye on transparency, because we were talking about trust, and trust depends on transparency, and some of these things on debates are no longer in the public arena.
So maybe actually if we just ask Emily to comment on officials' time, I think that's probably the most useful, and whether these opportunities to speak to the advisory committees are helpful, or whether that should just be paper. Yeah, do you want to just comment on that before I turn to Tim, who is well placed, having straddled the two?
I think they're slightly separate issues. So in terms of officials attending WFAC and NIFAC, it's up to directors who they want to send and whether they choose to go. I know the ones who have been have found it incredibly useful and do find the feedback very helpful. So it varies. We don't have a set approach. In terms of the repetition of an item on the comms between business committee and this meeting, that's quite unusual. We could have not covered it in such depth today. I think business committee gave it quite a good going over last week. So I think that's probably something just for us to pay attention to. I think the most useful use of directors' time is when you give us really good scrutiny and feedback and insight into things that we're wrestling with. And one of the things we did this time in the business committee with our performance report was highlight these 3 areas where we wanted to get feedback from you, which we have covered in this update, which was on the question of reputation and communication trust in the FSA, the question about there was sorry, I've lost it now. Anyway, and the KPIs on science, and there was another one. So that was where we sort of brought a topic and said, actually, this is the thing we're wrestling with. We'd really appreciate your feedback, and that is very useful to us.
Tim, did you want to add?
Yes, yeah. So thanks, Margaret. Yeah, I am hugely mindful of not duplicating and trying to make sure that the business committee serves its purpose. And we don't want to get into risk. What we want to look at is operational performance and provide that constructive feedback into the team. Things will get mentioned that actually necessarily need to be in audit or need to come back up to the board. And I think that's the opportunity within business committee to be able to recognise what it doesn't need to do and pivot those business items elsewhere. Directors' time, I mean, Emily's already covered, but directors only stay for the time that they're there for their item. Oh, do they? Oh, I'm sure I'll be excused some last time, but anyway. So that's blown that one out of the water. Well, maybe that's what we ought to do. And I also think there's a bit about communication with the wider board, because I do recognise that, I lived through the time where business committee was done as an adjunct to the board and all board members were there. And we probably just need to get right how other board members have access to those papers, whether that's that on request or whether that's just as routine. I'm very open to either of that. I think the thing is that we all have the opportunity to keep improving and finessing this so that it does what we need of it rather than just becomes a discursive conversation.
Anthony.
I have 2 or 3 hats on here, so I'll take the first hat, being the IRAC chair. I think it is important that we streamline, and myself and Tim have been meeting to discuss that, to make sure that we don't duplicate, but we do act in a complementary way. So we are trying to do that, and we will take that forward. With the NIFAC hat on, and I'm sure Rhiannon would agree, it is important that we actually see those papers and have people come present them. It'd be no point having the papers on their own. Sometimes directors come, mainly it's the team, the people who've written the paper, but it actually gives us an insight into the information we're feeding back here at the board, and wearing the board hat, I think, is a joined up system. It works. I don't want to see duplication of resource and effort and pressure on teams, but I do think there are different communities that we're dealing with here, and it is important that we have access to the right people at the right time.
Margaret?
Just very briefly, I think we can also, as board members, do things to help. For example, I was concerned that as the lead on incidents, I actually wasn't given information that the 2 committees in Wales and Northern Ireland were getting at one point, or that went to Business Committee. I've now talked to Rhiannon about it, and they're doing a deep dive, for example, into incidents in July, and I've asked her if I can just literally be an observer on that, and that's my way of making sure that I don't then go to the incidents team and ask them to come back and brief me separately.
Okay, that's helpful. I mean, we have got lead board members for most of the areas, and I think it is important that they are in regular contact with the relevant directors, so that we should avoid that. It's not always perfect all of the time, but we've got a collective responsibility. What I can say with absolute confidence is that I think the Business Committee, operating as a separate item, is giving way more scrutiny and way more attention than we were able to give it when we did it at the end of the board meeting. At that level, I feel like we have made a very, very, very positive step. I'm with Tim. We've now got into a good place. The P&R reports come on hugely. That will be published. Everybody will see that. I think that's really helpful. The accompanying narrative's good. So I think we're in a really good place, and now we can, now we can look to refine. So. Good. And talking about refining, I'm going to refine this agenda and get on to the next item. We are running a little bit behind time, but I'm going to turn now to Anthony to just summarise the latest ARAC committee, which also met last week.
Thank you, Chair. Again, I'll keep this short and focused. We dealt with a lot of internal papers, but we had the NAO, the National Audit Office, come along with the management letter for the 22-23 accounts. They highlighted any issues, and we discussed them. We went through it. It was quite a good area. We also looked at their audit plan for 23-24. Again, both those papers we should have had at the March meeting, but they were slightly delayed, and we took them at this time. In terms of the internal papers, we looked at draft governance statement. We looked at the risk management update. But one of the ones that I would like to point out was the Head of Internal Audit's report and opinion, which was very good. My personal view, having been on this committee for over a year or so now, is that the Internal Audit Service has significantly improved, and management's response to the internal audits has significantly improved going forward. So I'm really delighted to see that, and we'll keep that going. But the other thing that we did at the committee was we took an hour out and we did a deep dive, and we looked at local authority resources, both in terms of people and funding. We're not responsible for either, but we were looking to make sure what is the FSA's responsibility should statutory duties become difficult. We looked at it and we were reassured that all the steps we would expect to be taken to maintain the statutory functions were being delivered by our team, and that they were very much on the ball right across the piece. So that's it. If there's any questions, happy to take them.
Thank you. Any questions for Anthony? If not, I will just say huge thanks both to Anthony and indeed I should have said to Tim for chairing these 2 committees, and to board members for their contributions to them. I sat in on the ARAC meeting this week, and there is a huge amount of paperwork that underpins that, and it was very clear to me that members of ARAC are extremely attentive to that detail, and it does take up a lot of time. I'm really grateful for that. likewise on Business Committee, one of the functions of the P&R report, having got much more detailed, much more precise, is there's much more to comment on. Thank you all for the effort that goes into that. Right, we'll move on now. Really just an opportunity for Rhian and Anthony, if you want to update on any other matters relating to WFAC or NIFAC. We've heard lots of comments on individual papers as we've gone along. So I suppose this is really much more about any headline comments. I'm going to go to Rhian first, since we're here in North Wales, and also wanted to thank the members of the WFAC committee. Some of them were able to join us last night. That was a great opportunity for the board to be able to hear from them directly. And I do think these committees are an important way for us to connect ourselves into the sort of local culture, local issues, and just hear that much more local voice. So thank you to all the members of both committees, but really good to see some of the WFAC members last night.
Thank you, Susan. I know members were really pleased to join, and a few were able to come here today to observe the board, so thank you, and I hope you've enjoyed yourselves in Wales. We were really pleased to have you. So a very short update today from me. So the last themed meeting that we've had recently in April was on the food business landscape in Wales, just doing a deep dive on the challenges for growth and opportunities for innovation. We did that at the 0 to 5 Food Industry Centre in Cardiff Met. And it's been a bit of a theme, actually, for the board session this week, that the 3 food centres in Wales have come up time and again. So these are substantively funded by Welsh Government through the Project Helix, as it's called. And they've been going since 2016, and really the contribution those 3 centres in South, Mid and North Wales have made to food innovation in Wales now is starting to become very apparent. And I would encourage anybody who might imagine that aspects of that could be emulated elsewhere in the UK to have a look at the website is foodinnovation.wales, and on there is an impact report which runs to 2023, so it was posted there last year. There'll be another shortly which will illustrate some of the ways that those 3 centres have supported the food businesses in Wales. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that. I guess from me then, I'm looking forward, as Susan is, to meeting our new minister for in the Senedd for mental health and early years, Jane Bryant. I won't be able to meet her at the same time, unfortunately, that Susan is, but hope to as soon as I can. And very much looking forward to the opportunity to make sure that the work we do at WFAC and the work that we bring forward into the board sort of meets the expectations for the minister, as we tried to do for the Deputy Minister before her, Lynn Neagle. For me, I suppose, one specific topic, referring back to a themed meeting we had back in February, which speaks to the paper that Peter presented today on market authorisations, just joining that up. We asked that Deputy Minister, as we did across the other ministers across the UK, for that slightly shortened consultation period on those initial ideas about reform for market authorisations. And I just wanted to recognise how pleased WFAC are, how pleased I am that the FSA team were able to really meet that challenge of getting that really broad consultation. I've had a chat with Peter about the responses we got in Wales, and it's just really, it's great to see we were able to meet that ask of making sure that that consultation was broad and deep, even with a slightly shorter time frame. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. Finally, picking up the point, Margaret and I went to the Port of Liverpool. I did learn a great deal on that visit, and we've mentioned it a number of times today. And so taking some of that back via WFAC, and I'm really looking forward, I suppose, to having a look at the work of the ports in Wales. So Holyhead, Pembroke Dock, Fishguard, hopefully making a visit at some point. I'd like to see, because what was raised in Liverpool was those much, much larger, more experienced port staff contingents and their opportunity to train staff in Wales in how to operate. There's a willingness to do that. and so I'd like to sort of convey that back in Wales, really. Final thing from me is that the Royal Welsh Show is coming up in July. Susan's already mentioned it. We've got a day and a half, I think, where our company is Susan on her meetings. Really looking forward to that. I know WFAC members will be there as well, so it's a real chance to bring together a lot of different stakeholders. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Rhian. Anthony.
Thank you, Chair. Just to mention that we've had 3 new members join NIFAC since we last met: Mike Johnson, Janice McConnell and Judith Hamvey, who was our boardroom apprentice. Rhian has mentioned the work that they've been doing on food innovation, and we've done the same because we've been trying to actually coalesce the 2 agendas for WIFAC and NIFAC to make sure that we're covering the same sort of areas. So we've looked at the business landscape in Northern Ireland and factors that may develop innovation and growth, and we've taken that forward. We've also went out and had a look at a sandwich company to actually see what they do, how they do it, the nutrition levels, also to have a look at their sweet line might be the best description of it. The one thing that did strike me was that nutrition wasn't a big issue for them. If I'm being quite honest with you, they're very much of the view that it's about serving what the public want and making it as high a quality and best standard. But where they actually were quite good was the labelling, and the labelling going out, telling people exactly what they were getting, how they were doing that and taking it forward. We've had the Balmoral show, and I was able to join with Emily and have a walk around, met with the DAERA Minister, had a conversation or 2 there and seen his presentation on where the department is going, what they're likely to be doing going forward. We also met the DAERA Minister, myself and Andy, at the Ulster Farmers Union dinner a couple of weeks before that. And then we met again with the DAERA Minister, with yourself as the formal introduction. And I know that we were due to meet with Minister Swan, who has now stood down, but we'll meet with Minister Nesbitt in the coming weeks. But all in all, it's been a very busy time. There's been a lot of work going on. And what I can say is, since the work we did last year on revitalising NIFAC, I think it's really coming through, and you can see the engagement of the committee and the interactions with the local community.
Great, thank you, Anthony. And I'm sure many board members will be delighted to hear that Judith Hamvey's joined NIFAC, and that's a really good progression, I think, from her time as our board apprentice. Very good. So lots happening, lots of great work. Really good to hear all of that. So much good work we've overrun, and I apologise for that. But thank you all very much. Are there any matters of other business that people wanted to raise? There's just one thing that I realise I perhaps should have said at the start. We were, and many stakeholders will be aware, we were planning to launch our annual report on food standards next week. And in fact, there were events planned in each of the countries. That's obviously another thing which has had to be delayed because of the timing of the general election. As you know, that's something we do jointly with Food Standards Scotland, and so I have been in discussion with Heather Kelman about when we may be able to launch that. The report is finished, but it is really about when we're able to both publish it, lay it in the respective parliaments, and then we're looking at dates now. I think it is quite possible that will, because of differences in timetables, it's quite possible that won't be until after the summer. But we are planning to hold some stakeholder or other events to mark that launch at the same time, and we'll be in touch with people in due course when those arrangements have been made, and very much hope that board members will be able to come to some of those, because I think it is a really good opportunity for us to meet with stakeholders. So on that note, I don't think those events will happen before our next board meeting. So I guess at this stage, given that we are the middle of June, I hope people have a good summer, and I look forward to seeing you all at our board meeting in September. It always feels like it comes around quite quickly over the summer when we're going to be in Peterborough. And of course, our usual pattern of monthly keeping in touch calls and our regular board briefings will continue. I'm sure, well, it has the potential to be a busier than usual summer this year, and we'll obviously keep you in close touch and update at the next board meeting. Anyway, on that note, thank you all very much indeed for your time, and safe travels home. Thank you.